Buried beneath sand and silence, Egypt still guards its greatest secrets. Not the pyramids, not the pharaohs, but the questions that refuse to die, mysteries that defy science, logic, and even time itself. Forgotten gods, severed hands, mummified scrolls, and a bird that maybe just maybe flew. This isn't the Egypt you know. This is the Egypt they don't want you to explain. Welcome to the strangest, darkest, most unexplained enigmas of the ancient world. Welcome to the most unknown mysteries of ancient Egypt. Before we crack open tombs and unravel ancient riddles, hit that subscribe button to join us on this descent into the unexplained. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let's see how far these mysteries travel. The Saqqara bird's purpose. In 1898, buried beneath the sands of Saqqara, Egypt's sprawling necropolis of nobles, scribes, and sacred beasts, a curious artifact was unearthed from a Ptolemaic tomb. Carved from sycamore wood and measuring a modest 7 inches, the object bore a resemblance more avian than divine. It had the wingspan of a bird, a tail that lacked the usual fanning, and a vertical rudder instead. On its body, a faint hieroglyphic inscription, the gift of Amun. To the average observer, it looked like a toy, perhaps a child's plaything, left behind in the hush of a tomb. But for those who looked closer, too close for comfort, it looked like something else. A glider. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the Saqqara bird became one of the most debated relics in all of Egyptology. Engineers and aviation enthusiasts began to whisper the unthinkable. What if this was not a toy or a votive offering, but a scale model of an actual aircraft? Cue the dramatic zoom. Its wings are curved, its body symmetrical, and most bafflingly, its design boasts features of modern aerodynamics. Dr. Khalil Messiha, a physician and avocational Egyptologist, was one of the first to propose the aviation theory in the 1960s. He claimed the object possessed features consistent with principles of flight, including a dihedral angle to stabilize movement. In 2002, aerospace engineer Simon Sanderson even built a scale model of the Saqqara bird and demonstrated its potential to glide soaring through air like something out of a time-traveling Wright brothers' dream. Of course, mainstream Egyptology scoffed. The bird was symbolic, they said, a representation of the bathed human soul, which was often depicted as a bird flitting between this world and the next. Maybe it was a ceremonial piece. Maybe an offering to Horus, god of the sky, maybe just a wooden whimsy. But maybe not. There's one detail that hounds this mystery, like the whisper of ancient wind, the absence of a tailplane. Most gliders, even those made by hobbyists, require a horizontal stabilizer to control pitch. The Saqqara bird has none. It's as if it was built to challenge conventional logic or to hint at an aerodynamic philosophy that's been lost for 2,000 years. And here's where the story begins to spiral. If the Saqqara bird was merely symbolic, why design it with such mathematical precision? Why does it match the lift-to-weight ratio of modern gliders? Why do its wings resemble those of contemporary aircraft rather than actual birds? And here's a fun twist. In 2006, a group of researchers added a tailplane to a scale model of the Saqqara bird, correcting the suspected flaw. With the addition, the bird not only glided, it soared, stable and true, as if finally completing a 2,000-year-old flight plan. Theories abound: ancient lost technology, forgotten windcraft, or the ever-popular, they were just really, really good at symbolism. Maybe, but even the skeptics admit, it's weird. And then, there's the context. Saqqara isn't some fringe site. It's the ancient burial ground of Memphis, the old capital. It's where the step pyramid of Djoser stands, the world's first large-scale cut stone structure. It's a place of firsts. If someone, somewhere in the shadows of time, was experimenting with flight, there are worse places to do it than in the spiritual heartland of Egyptian engineering. But perhaps the most unsettling idea isn't that the Egyptians built model aircraft. It's that they might have built something more and buried the prototypes beneath the very sands that now whisper their name. Of course, we have no blueprints, no crash sites, no airports of antiquity, just a 7-inch wooden bird, too precise to ignore and too small to satisfy. But its wings still whisper. They whisper of flight. They whisper of secrets. They whisper of mysteries that refuse to stay grounded. And just when you think this is as bizarre as ancient Egypt, hold your falcons, because the next mystery drags us out of the sands and into the pharmacology labs, where ancient lungs tell tales of a very different kind of trip. Understood. I'll begin the next segment now. The cocaine mummies. The year was 1992, and Dr. Svetlana Balabanova, a respected German toxicologist, was working late in her lab in Munich. She wasn't trying to upend the timeline of human exploration. She wasn't hunting for lost transatlantic voyages. She was just doing what scientists do: running tests, analyzing data, and double-checking numbers. The samples on her table were fragments of ancient Egyptian mummy, specifically hair and soft tissue from a set of bodies housed in the Munich Museum of Egyptian Art. The goal was routine: test for substances that might give insight into medicinal practices or ritual embalming. What she found was a chemical ghost story. Nicotine, cocaine, not trace amounts, not contamination, real, unmistakable presence. Compounds pulled straight from plants that, at least according to the entire structure of Western historical knowledge, had never set root in the ancient Nile. Because both of those alkaloids, nicotine from tobacco and cocaine from the coca plant, are indigenous to the Americas. And suddenly, everything got weird. Balabanova triple-checked her results. She reran the tests. She tested other mummies. Same outcome. The compounds were embedded in the ancient keratin of mummy hair, sealed within the molecular layers of skin, not modern contamination, not a museum worker on break with a Marlboro. These chemicals were old, ancient, entombed with their hosts for thousands of years. And if the implications hadn't already sent a chill up her spine, the academic reaction did. The Egyptology community didn't just raise eyebrows, it raised pitchforks. Her results were met with disbelief, ridicule, and outright hostility. Because if she was right, it meant something fundamental had to give. Either the drugs weren't exclusive to the New World, or the ancient Egyptians, or someone trading with them, had crossed an ocean 3,000 years before Columbus. No one was ready for that conversation. But Balabanova wasn't alone for long. Independent labs corroborated her findings. Additional mummies tested positive, some in museums in Britain, others in Egypt itself. The nicotine readings were especially hard to ignore, represent in up to 90% of mummies tested, sometimes in levels comparable to modern smokers. And that's when the debate stopped being academic and became theological. Not in a religious sense, but in the sense of sacred beliefs, historical dogma. Because history, like any powerful narrative, has its priests. And the idea that pre-Columbian transoceanic contact might have occurred isn't just controversial, it's heretical. Let's unpack the possibilities. One theory is contamination. The idea that museum workers, cleaning crews, or even ancient soil mixed with the samples. But contamination doesn't explain the internal presence of the chemicals deep within tissue, consistent across multiple specimens and storage conditions. It doesn't explain why some of the cleanest, best preserved mummies, those untouched for centuries, still register these compounds. Another theory suggests misidentification. Maybe the Egyptians had access to old world plants with similar alkaloids like certain nightshades that contain trace nicotine. But none produce it in the concentrations detected. And cocaine? That's harder to handwave. There's no old-world plant that produces anything chemically close. So, what if the unthinkable is thinkable? What if there were ancient trade routes that link the Nile to the Americas? There's no map, no manifest. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Pacific Ocean is littered with ancient contact anomalies, plants and parasites that shouldn't have spread where they did, artifacts turning up far from their point of origin, myths that echo across hemispheres. And suddenly, this isn't just about a mummy's lungs, it's about ancient globalization, a theory that dares to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the oceans weren't as uncrossable as we thought. Let's take a breath and look at the wider picture. Ancient Egyptian trade was robust. They moved obsidian from Ethiopia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. They built ships, not just river boats, but ocean-going vessels, with keels and sail plans that suggest more than casual fishing trips. The shipwreck at Wadi Gawasis, dated to the reign of Hatshepsut, revealed planks and timbers of seafaring construction along with cargo destined for the fabled land of Punt. We still don't know exactly where Punt was. Some say East Africa, others say southern Arabia. A few, quietly, suggest further. There's also the Mesoamerican angle. The Olmecs, flourishing around the same time as the New Kingdom, built colossal stone heads and left behind high culture ruins but little explanation. Some theories not accepted by mainstream academia, but not entirely dismissible, suggest contact with old world civilizations. The presence of nicotine and cocaine in Egyptian remains adds fuel to this speculative fire. And then there are the mummies themselves. Not just those tested in Germany. Over the years, additional remains have shown similar results, including mummified remains of animals, apes, birds, even fish, prepared as funerary offerings. Some of these, too, contained alkaloids. Could these have been used in ritual? Could Egyptian priests have imported exotic plants for spiritual or pharmacological reasons? Could there have been trade routes, direct or indirect, that ferried coca leaves across oceans, perhaps via intermediate cultures? This isn't just an Egypt story. Traces of Old World plants have been found in New World contexts and vice versa. Egyptian-style artifacts have appeared in South America, though, often dismissed as forgeries or misidentifications, but maybe not all of them are fakes. And that's what this mystery does best. It shakes the pillars. Because if even one mummy had authentic pre-Columbian traces of New World drugs, then history has a hole in it wide enough to sail a papyrus ship through. Of course, there's another layer to this tale, the psychological. Why are we so resistant to the idea that ancient people were capable of global contact? We assume our ancestors were isolated, bound by geography and ignorance. We assume oceans were barriers, not highways. But every culture with a shoreline builds boats. And eventually, some of those boats go farther than anyone planned. The Polynesians reached Hawaii and Easter Island. The Norse touched North America. The Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa. The idea that Egyptians, with their extensive nautical infrastructure and spiritual curiosity, might have stumbled onto a new land isn't implausible. It's just uncomfortable. Because it changes the story. It says that the age of exploration didn't begin in the 15th century. It says humans have been connecting across continents for far longer than we give them credit for. It says that under every stone sarcophagus and every glass display case, there might be a story we're still not ready to hear. And at the heart of it all is a mummy. A woman wrapped in linen, silent for 3,000 years, holding inside her the scent of a jungle she should never have known. Cocaine, nicotine, and an unanswered question. Where did she go? Or more terrifying still, who came to her? And while that mystery is unsettling, it's only the beginning. Because just when you think ancient Egypt can't get stranger than drug-sniffing mummies, we descend into a tale even older, even grander, and perhaps more lost than any pyramid. A vast structure, described by ancient historians as a wonder of the world, hidden beneath the sands, almost entirely erased from history. They called it the labyrinth. If your mind's already spinning from ancient gliders and transatlantic drugs, buckle up, we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. And, hey, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let's map this mystery across the globe. The Lost Labyrinth of Hawara. Before Herodotus ever laid eyes on the pyramids, before he carved his place into the pantheon of ancient chroniclers, he was told about a Placia structure so immense, so confusing, so overwhelming in its detail, that it made the Great Pyramid look quaint. I saw it myself, he wrote in the 5th century BCE, and it is beyond anything I can describe. Let that sink in. The man who had no problem describing Nile crocodiles in ridiculous detail, who could wax poetic about Persian cavalry tactics for pages, was stumped by architecture. Herodotus claimed that the labyrinth at Hawara, located near the entrance to the Fayum oasis, was greater than all the buildings of the Greeks put together. He said it had 12 courts, all roofed, all facing one another, with 3,000 room shafts above ground, half below. The lower half, he was told, held the tombs of kings and sacred crocodiles. He wasn't allowed down there. Centuries later, the Roman geographer Strabo visited the same site. What he saw was a ruin, but still described its remnants as vast and intricate, with corridors that disoriented even the most seasoned traveler. Pliny the Elder, another old-world name-dropper, echoed the same awe. The labyrinth, he said, was built to rival the wonders of the world. And yet, here we are, 25 centuries later, and most people have never even heard of it. That's not just weird, that's suspicious. Let's dig literally. The structure was believed to have been built during the reign of Amenemhat III in the 12th dynasty, around 1850 BCE. Amenemhat was no amateur. He was one of the most prolific builders of the Middle Kingdom, known for pushing the limits of scale and ambition. His pyramid at Hawara, often referred to as the Black Pyramid, due to the color of its weathered mud brick, stood nearby the alleged labyrinth. Now, the theory goes that the labyrinth was built adjacent to the pyramid as a mortuary temple or administrative complex, but what Herodotus and others describe doesn't sound like any other Egyptian mortuary temple. It sounds like something else entirely: less tomb, more vault, less temple, more enigma. The structure was said to be so confusing, so maze-like, that no outsider could navigate it without a guide. That's not just ceremonial architecture, that's intentional obfuscation. Think about it. In a civilization obsessed with death, order, and eternity, why build a literal maze unless you had something to hide? And that brings us to the modern day, where archaeologists have tried and mostly failed to uncover the truth. In the late 19th century, British archaeologist Flinders Petrie led an excavation at Hawara. Petrie found traces of the labyrinth's foundations, columns, massive blocks, shattered floors, but not the rooms, not the underground chambers, not the maze. He concluded that the structure had been dismantled in antiquity, its stones quarried by later civilizations, perhaps by the Romans, who were notorious for recycling Egyptian monuments into bathhouses and forums. But not everyone agrees. In 2008, a team of Belgian and Egyptian researchers from the Mataha expedition used ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the surface near the pyramid of Amenemhat III. What they found was tantalizing. Patterns consistent with large man-made chambers extending underground, long corridors, gridded cavities, subsurface anomalies that, if excavated, could confirm the legends. And yet, The project was abruptly halted. No formal reason was given. The findings were never officially published in a peer-reviewed journal. The raw data vanished into the bureaucratic sands of the Egyptian Antiquities Authority. For conspiracy theorists, this was red meat. For academics, it was frustrating. For the rest of us, it was classic ancient Egypt. Something impossibly large, impossibly buried, and wrapped in just enough intrigue to make the hair on your arms stand up. Now let's do some math. If the labyrinth was real and not just a temple, but a structure containing thousands of rooms, it would be the largest architectural endeavor of its time, far larger than the Great Pyramid. In fact, some estimates suggest it would have required more stone than the Great Pyramid itself. So where did it all go? Where's the debris? Where are the columns? Some of it, we know, was likely pillaged. Columns matching descriptions of the labyrinth's upper halls were found at nearby Roman ruins, but not all of it. A structure that large doesn't disappear completely. It has to go somewhere. Unless the majority of it was underground. And remains underground. Herodotus wasn't allowed into the lower chambers. Strabo only saw ruins. Petrie found rubble. The Mataha team saw something, then said nothing. It's a pattern so Egyptian, it could be carved in stone. The idea that the labyrinth still lies beneath the earth, intact or collapsed, untouched for millennia, is almost too perfect. And if it's still there? That raises questions even bigger than where? Like, why? Why build such a structure in the first place? Some believe it was a prison for the dead away to confuse the souls of those not pure enough to reach the afterlife. Others suggest it was an initiation temple, where priests would undergo trials in the darkness, symbolically dying and being reborn. But the most tantalizing theory? A vault, a literal labyrinth to protect something ancient Egypt didn't want anyone to find. Maybe it was records books of wisdom, predating even dynastic Egypt. Maybe it was sacred artifacts, hidden from conquerors. Or maybe it was something stranger. Something the pharaohs couldn't destroy, but refused to let see the light of day. Think of it as Egypt's Area 51. And we can't forget the symbolic weight of a labyrinth. In myth, it's always the same. The maze protects a secret, a monster, a treasure. The journey through it is a trial, and the one who reaches the center never comes out the same. Now zoom out. Ancient Egypt was obsessed with the concept of hidden knowledge, the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, the spells and inscriptions that only the worthy could decipher. Everything was layered, encrypted in architecture, astronomy, and allegory. The labyrinth wasn't just a building. It was an ideology, a fortress of meaning, built to be unsolved. And we haven't solved it. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's still there, beneath the sands of Hawara, waiting for the tools, the will, or the recklessness to uncover it. And until someone does, the labyrinth remains what it's always been. A ghost of stone, seen only by those willing to believe in the impossible. But if you think getting lost in a stone maze is terrifying, wait until you hear about a pyramid that was deliberately obliterated, dome that may have rivaled the Great Pyramid in scale, and was nearly erased from history by fire, war, or something far stranger. Its ruins sit in silence, shattered at the edge of the desert. And the story of its destruction? That's a whole different kind of labyrinth. The destroyed pyramid of Dendera. In the searing heat of the western desert, about 8 kilometers north of Giza, lies a broken crown, scattering of megalithic wreckage that looks more like the aftermath of a war than the ruins of a royal monument. Sand swirls through its fractured stones, whispering the name of a forgotten pharaoh, Dendera. For centuries, Egyptologists barely blinked at the ruins at Abu Rawash. Overshadowed by its more famous cousins Khufu's Great Pyramid, Khafre's temple-lined monolith Dendera's Pyramid, was considered a historical footnote, a failed project, a half-finished imitation. Something that didn't quite make the cut. But then archaeologists started digging. What they found didn't look like a failure. It looked like something that had been violently, almost obsessively dismantled. Dendera, the son and immediate successor of Khufu, ascended to the throne during Egypt's fourth dynastian era of engineering miracles, when the very bones of the desert were cut and stacked into eternal geometries. He ruled for only about 8 years, and during that time, chose to build his pyramid not at Giza, alongside his father and brother, but at Abu Rawasha barren, elevated plateau overlooking the Nile Valley. That choice alone raised eyebrows. Why break with the family tradition? Why distance yourself from one of the greatest architectural achievements of human history unless you were trying to make a statement? That statement may have been vertical. Modern reconstructions suggest that Djendere's pyramid, if completed as intended, would have stood taller than the Great Pyramid itself, reaching a height of approximately 220 meters above sea level, thanks to its elevated location. Structurally, its core design indicates an ambition to rival, if not outshine, Khufu's legacy. Unlike later pyramids built with internal economies in mind, Djendere's project spared no expense. Granite and limestone were hauled from quarries far to the south. The causeway alone was nearly 1.7 kilometers long, longer than any pyramid causeway ever built. And yet today, it looks like a battlefield. The superstructure is gone. The smooth casing stones vanished. The interior chambers collapsed or stripped bare. What remains are massive, disjointed blocks scattered like the aftermath of divine wrath. To the untrained eye, it looks more like a quarry than a pyramid. And that's precisely what some have claimed. The first theory posits Roman destruction. According to this narrative, the pyramid was repurposed as a convenient quarry during the Roman occupation of Egypt. The high-quality limestone and granite blocks were too tempting to leave buried in sand, and Roman builders, with their usual brutal pragmatism, dismantled the structure piece by piece. But the evidence doesn't fully align. First, the pattern of destruction is too chaotic. Roman quarries leave signature systematic cuts, tool marks, extraction ramps. The damage at Abu Rawash looks more like detonation than demolition. Massive blocks lie shattered in place. Whole sections of wall were not removed, but obliterated. It's as if someone wanted to erase the pyramid, not recycle it. The second theory, darker and more compelling, is political damnatio memoriae, ancient practice of erasing someone from history. Dendera, unlike his father Khufu or his brother Khafre, has long existed in the shadows of Egypt's royal narrative. His name was absent from some king lists, his statues defaced, his achievements minimized. Could it be that Dendera was deliberately destroyed? If so, the motive might lie in dynastic intrigue. Some sources suggest Dendera's relationship with his family was strained. There are hints he may have been involved in his father's death or that his reign represented a schism in the royal house. His decision to build at Abu Rawash could have symbolized not just independence, but defiance. And that defiance might have cost him everything. After his death, his successors may have sought revenge not just in stone, but in silence. If you erase the pyramid, you erase the man. But even that theory doesn't account for the full picture. Because as with so many Egyptian mysteries, the ruins tell two stories, the one we think we know and the one that doesn't fit. Let's look at what remains. Fragments of a colossal red granite head, once part of a statue of Dendera, lie buried in the sand. The craftsmanship is exquisite, more detailed than most royal portraiture of the period. His face, though damaged, shows a unique expression, calm, determined, human. Not the stylized ideal of eternity, but a ruler carved as he was. Nearby, the remnants of an unusual solar boat pit suggest he was continuing his father's obsession with celestial travel, but with a twist. Dendera was the first pharaoh to adopt the title Son of Ra, a shift that changed the religious landscape of the Old Kingdom forever. He didn't just want to be seen as a divine king. He wanted to be the literal offspring of the sun god. That's not just vanity, that's doctrine. And here's where it gets strange. Some researchers believe that Djedefre's pyramid was not just a tomb, but a temple part of a solar complex meant to harness celestial alignments. Abu Rawash's elevated location would have offered an unobstructed view of the horizon, perfect for rituals timed to solar risings and settings. The orientation of the site suggests intentional alignments with key astral events. This wasn't a burial site. It was a celestial engine, and someone, at some point, made sure it stopped functioning. Which brings us to a final, chilling possibility. What if Djedefre's pyramid wasn't destroyed in antiquity? What if it failed? Some believe the structure was compromised from the start. The bedrock at Abu Rawash is uneven and brittle in places. The design may have been too ambitious, the materials stretched too thin. There's even evidence that parts of the internal chambers collapsed during construction. Perhaps Djedefre died before it was complete. Perhaps his successors chose to abandon it, viewing the site as cursed. But if that were true, why return to strip it down? Why erase it from the king lists? Why scatter its stones to the wind? Something doesn't add up. The pyramid was powerful politically, symbolically, maybe even cosmologically. And like the labyrinth before it, it has vanished almost entirely, leaving only questions in its place. Who destroyed Djedefre's pyramid? Why did they try so hard to erase it? What did they fear people might find there? The answers are buried beneath tons of broken granite and layers of official silence. But if this ruined pyramid tells a story of power scrubbed from history, the next mystery reveals a truth preserved in the most primal way imaginable, severed, counted, and buried in pits of sand. Hands. Not metaphorical ones, literal ones. 16 severed right hands, 4 pits, 1 ancient city. And the blood-stained custom behind it still echoes across millennia. The severed hands in Avaris. Avaris was a city of paradox. Located in the eastern Nile Delta, it was once the capital of the Hyksos foreign rulers of Egypt who arrived as outsiders and stayed long enough to carve their names into the bedrock of history. It was a place where cultures collided, Canaanite and Egyptian, warrior and merchant, god and king. But Avaris wasn't just a crossroads of politics and trade. It was also a stage for something far older, far darker. In 2017, beneath the shifting soil of what was once a palace complex, Austrian archaeologists made a discovery that forced even the most seasoned Egyptologists to pause. 4 pits, 16 right hands. No arms, no torsos, no skulls. Just hands, severed, carefully placed, and all of them right. They were buried in front of a throne room, an architectural choice as theatrical as it was deliberate. Like trophies, like warnings, like currency. To understand this ritual, you have to look at Egypt, not as a kingdom of stone and sand, but as an empire of order and the necessary violence used to maintain it. The Hyksos, who ruled during Egypt's second intermediate period, circa 1650–1550 BCE, were a Semitic-speaking people often portrayed as invaders in the pharaonic narrative. But they were more than that. They were administrators, builders, and warriors. They adopted Egyptian customs while bringing their own a hybrid culture forged in occupation. And in the case of these hands, a hybrid horror. The practice of severing hands in battle wasn't unknown in ancient Egypt. Wall reliefs dating back to the 18th dynasty depict victorious soldiers presenting dismembered limbs to their commanders. Inscriptions describe how enemy hands were brought as proof of kills, often exchanged for gold, in the measure of the hand. The logic was brutal. If you couldn't bring back a head, bring back a hand. It was easier to transport, easier to count. It was death reduced to digits. But never before had this practice been found in the flesh. Until Avaris. The hands were laid flat, some splayed wide, others curled slightly as if they had been cut fresh and placed quickly. The bones bore no signs of disease or age. They were strong, adult hands. Mostly male, some large, built for weapons, others delicate, possibly from high-ranking captives. Who they belonged to is still a mystery. Were they enemies of the Hyksos, prisoners of war, rebellious subjects, or disturbingly, victims of an internal purge? What's clear is that the placement wasn't random. The pits were directly in front of the palace's throne platform, a ceremonial site likely used for judgment, reward, and punishment. To bury human remains there, and only hands, suggests a display meant to sanctify violence, a ritual of subtraction. Take the hand, take the power. But this wasn't just mutilation. This was accounting. Each hand was likely presented to the ruler, possibly King Khayan, one of the most powerful Hyksos pharaohs, proof of conquest, a tally of blood, a scorecard of supremacy. And here's where it gets darker. These were not battlefield remains. There were no arrowheads or sword marks in the surrounding soil, no burned earth, no signs of mass conflict. These hands were removed in a controlled, likely ceremonial environment. Imagine the scene. Prisoners brought before the throne, their hands severed and placed in the pit, not in chaos, but in ritual, a procession of violence performed not for necessity, but for demonstration. A message carved in cartilage. This kind of ritual mutilation wasn't isolated to Egypt. In ancient Mesoamerica, hands were severed as part of sacrifice. In medieval Europe, thieves and traitors lost their right hands. The symbolism was universal. The right hand was the hand of action, of oath, of honor. To remove it was to unmake a person's agency, to deny them not just combat, but identity. But Avaris is unique. It combines ritual, military reward, and political theater into one grim spectacle. And still, the questions multiply. Why 16? Why 4 pits? The numbers don't match any known military unit sizes or sacrificial quotas. Could it be that each pit represented a different event, or a different enemy tribe? Were they spaced over time, or part of one grand grisly ceremony? We don't know, and that's the recurring curse of ancient Egypt. The story is always missing its last chapter. There are no inscriptions beside the pits, no wall reliefs showing the severing, just bones, sand, and silence. But the implications are chilling. Because this was the seat of power, the heart of a city. The hands were not buried in shame or secrecy, but pride. They were trophies, yes, but also offerings, proof of conquest given to a god king who demanded tribute in flesh, and like so much of Egyptian ritual, it was likely repeated, again and again, with each conquest, each uprising, each need to remind the people who held the blade and who did not. It also challenges the neat image we often paint of Egyptian civility. Pyramids, papyri, perfumial, hiding a bedrock of blood. The same culture that mummified cats also buried hands like sacred artifacts. The same society that pioneered medicine could also innovate mutilation. Duality was baked into the Egyptian worldview. Life and death, order and chaos, creation and dismemberment. And nowhere is that clearer than in Avaris. Today, the pits remain, cordoned off, studied, preserved, but the hands still whisper, knuckles curled in protest, fingers frozen mid-gesture. Who were they? Warriors, rebels, innocents? And what did they know before the blade came down? The answers are gone, swallowed by centuries. But the bones remain, pale against the black eartha tableau of conquest and cruelty. And just when you think you've reached the bottom of Egypt's anatomical archive, a new layer opens, not in the battlefield, not in the throne room, but in the embalmer's workshop, where ancient chemists, cloaked in resin fumes and ritual, mixed the oils of eternity and left behind something that even today we struggle to decipher: the unraveling of mummification oils. In the flickering shadows of an ancient workshop, a priest stands over a corpse. He does not pray. He measures. This is not a ritual of words. It is a ritual of science. He dips a bronze ladle into a black resin. He pours. He rubs. He counts the heartbeats of decay and cuts the process off just before putrefaction begins. He anoints the corpse with oil, some thick and bitter, others fragrant and light. Each one has a purpose, each one a sequence. He is not embalming a body. He is embalming time. And what we've only just begun to understand 3,000 years later is that the Egyptians didn't just preserve flesh. They engineered immortality. We've known for centuries that mummification was more than just a glorified drying process. It was a chemical ballet, a slow, deliberate transformation of living tissue into sacred artifact. But it's only recently, thanks to breakthroughs in biomolecular archaeology and residue analysis, that we've begun to decode what exactly the Egyptians were doing with all those mysterious oils. The big reveal? They weren't winging it. In 2023, researchers uncovered an embalming workshop at Saqqara of the most complete ever found. Tucked away in sealed niches were dozens of ceramic vessels, each labeled in hieratic script. For the first time, we weren't guessing. We had the ancient pharmacist's instructions. And what they told us was stunning. One jar read, "For the head." Another, "To be placed under the ribs." These were not generic oils, they were targeted applications, and inside the vessels, chemical signatures from a staggering array of substances: juniper, elemi, cedar, cypress, myrrh, frankincense, and shockingly exotic resins from as far away as Southeast Asia. Think about that. The same civilization that carved temples from bedrock was importing tree sap across thousands of kilometers to preserve royal corpses. Not for show, for science. Because this wasn't just about smell or ceremony. It was biochemistry. Let's get clinical. When a human body dies, it begins to decompose almost immediately. Bacteria multiply, gases build, tissues liquefy. The Egyptians' goal was to halt this process not with refrigeration, but with chemistry, and they did it with ruthless efficiency. They used natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, to desiccate the body. They removed organs except the heart, in earlier periods to prevent internal decay. But the oils? The oils were the real magic. Take juniper oil. It has antibacterial properties. Myrrh and frankincense? Antimicrobial and insecticidal. Cedar resin creates a protective barrier, sealing tissues from moisture. Each substance chosen not for scent, but for function. It wasn't just embalming. It was embattling decay itself. And the precision is staggering. Some oils were used only on the face, others only on the feet. The scalp, the rib cage, the genitalia each had its own recipe. This wasn't a one-size-fits-all process. It was custom-tailored to the corpse. Elite mummies royalty, high priests, nobility received the full treatment. A pharmacological symphony of dozens of oils and balms, applied in a specific sequence over 70 days. Lesser individuals? Maybe 3 or 4 steps. A basic desiccation and a quick wrap. The socioeconomic mummification gap was real. But even the simplest burials often included oils, because to the Egyptians, these weren't just chemicals, they were sacred. Each oil was linked to a deity: myrrh for Isis, cedar for Osiris, frankincense for Ra. The act of embalming wasn't just scientific, it was mythological. The oils turned the body into a temple, and the workshop was the altar. So what changed? Why are we only now discovering this? Why did such a sophisticated system fall into obscurity? Partly, it's about decay not of flesh, but of records. Papyrus scrolls crumble, oral traditions vanish, and for centuries, the real formulae of mummification were guarded secrets, trade knowledge, family recipes passed down through generations of embalmers who guarded them like state secrets. Then came conquest. First the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. Each wave chipped away at the sacred science. Some embalming traditions were preserved, but many were lost, collapsed under centuries of misinterpretation, dilution, and religious suppression. And so, we forgot. For hundreds of years, the Western understanding of mummification was cartoonish. We imagined Egyptians stuffing bodies with sawdust and linen, slathering them with tar, and hoping for the best. But now, with gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, we're reading the molecular fingerprints of history. We're finding that the ancient embalmers were closer to pharmacists than priests. Their workshop floors were labs. Their tools were calibrated. Their oils were tested, refined, and recorded. And we still haven't cracked the full code. For all the labeled jars, there are still unidentified substances, compounds that don't match any known modern reference. Exotic resins, unknown fixatives, fragrances that no longer exist. It's entirely possible that the Egyptians were working with now extinct plant species, or that they developed chemical extraction techniques we've yet to replicate. That's the twist. The farther we dig, the more it feels like we're chasing the tail of a civilization that outpaced us in ways we're only starting to grasp. They preserved bodies for 3,000 years. Can your modern funeral home promise that? Even now, Connecticut scans of royal mummies like Seti I and Ramesses II show minimal decay, tight wrappings, intact facial features. In some cases, we can detect their last meals, their dental health, their diseases. All thanks to the precision of oils and salts applied in a chamber that looked more like a pharmaceutical lab than a tomb. The Egyptians weren't embalming the dead. They were embalming memory. They were locking time in place, molecule by molecule, oil by oil. And while we're finally starting to understand the recipes, one thing remains elusive: the full ritual, the order, the timing, the chants, gestures, and symbolism layered over the science. Because even as we decode the chemistry, we're still missing the why behind the how. And that question only deepens when we look at what they carved on their walls. Because in one temple, tucked into the stonework of Dendera, is an image that has baffled scholars, thrilled conspiracy theorists, and teased the edge of possibility for decades. An image that looks uncannily like a light bulb. The purpose of the Dendera light bulb reliefs. It's carved into stone, high in the crypts beneath the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. Series of images so anachronistic, so outrageously specific, that even the most grounded observer can't help but blink. They call it the Dendera light. And it looks, for all the world, like a massive electric bulb. You can see it yourself, a bulbous, translucent enclosure, a thick cable-like stem emerging from its base, a serpent-like filament curling inside, all of it resting atop what looks like a socket or insulator, and being handled by figures in reverent poses. Surrounding this are other symbols: lotus flowers, deities, and what appears to be a coiled wire running to a power source. It doesn't look metaphorical. It looks technological. The relief appears in multiple instances within the subterranean chambers of Dendera's temple complex, which dates back to the Greco-Roman period but sits on top of much older foundations, potentially stretching into the Old Kingdom. The temple itself is dedicated to Hathor, goddess of music, fertility, and celestial harmony, but its hidden chambers are anything but harmonious. They are cryptic, claustrophobic, designed for secrecy. This isn't a display wall, it's a vault. And what's carved here has lit up debates both academic and fringe for over half a century. Let's start with the mainstream interpretation. According to Egyptologists, the Dendera light is not a light bulb at all. It is, rather, a symbolic depiction of the Harsomptis mytha representation of the creation cycle. The serpent inside the enclosure is the god Harsomptis, manifesting as a snake emerging from a lotus flower, symbol of rebirth, held aloft by a djed pillar, symbol of stability. The enclosure itself? A stylized womb or container of creation, perhaps a variation of the solar bark that ferries gods across the heavens. From this view, the whole thing is spiritual metaphor, wrapped in ritual iconography. But then, there's the other view. And it's gaining traction not in academia, but in the public imagination. The alternative theory proposes that this is a form of lost technology, that the Dendera reliefs depict an ancient electrical device, possibly even a functioning light source. Supporters point to the bulb shape, the filament, the cable, and what appears to be insulation. They cite the lack of soot in deep tomb chamber show. Did they see what they were carving without fire? As circumstantial evidence that something more advanced was at work. They point to similar shapes in Babylonian artifacts, and to the Baghdad Bateria, 2,000-year-old clay jar found in Iraq, containing a copper cylinder and iron rod, possibly capable of generating a mild electric charge if filled with acidic liquid. Combine that with Dendera, and the theory writes itself. Ancient electricity, forgotten knowledge, a pre-industrial science smothered by time. So, which is it? Is the Dendera light a metaphor for creation, or a literal device from a forgotten chapter of human ingenuity? To answer that, we have to dig deeper than just the shape. We have to ask what the Egyptians knew, and what they could have known. The ancient Egyptians were masters of practical technology. They engineered vast irrigation systems, developed surgical instruments, mapped the stars, and aligned their temples with solstice events accurate to within fractions of a degree. They understood static electricity, as evidenced by descriptions of linen attracting particles after being rubbed. They used copper, gold, and electroconductive metals. But they never wrote down anything remotely resembling a schematic. No scrolls, no instructions, no repeatable devices. Just these carvings. Just this mystery. If they did discover electricity or something close to it, it wasn't recorded in any text we found. It wasn't replicated across other temples. No sockets, wires, or filaments have been recovered. And yet, there's that image, that shape, that serpent, curling like a coil, glowing like a filament. It's easy to dismiss it. It's also easy to obsess over it, especially when you realize the light appears in a chamber with only one small, winding entrance, a space with no natural light, where torches would have suffocated the air or blackened the walls. And yet, the carvings are immaculate, precise, delicate, as if made in clear visibility, as if lit from within. Some theorists have even built replicas using modern materials to mimic what they see in the relief. With a glass bulb, an inert gas, a coil of metal, and a rudimentary power source, they've created a functional, if dim, light. It's crude, it's unstable, but it works. Not proof of ancient electricity, but proof that it's not impossible. But the Dendera light isn't just a puzzle of wires and stone. It's a mirror reflecting our need to find ourselves in the past, to believe that the ancients weren't just wise, they were brilliant, that they held secrets we've forgotten, that somewhere beneath the sand lies a technology not of the future, but of the beginning. And maybe they did. Maybe the Dendera light bulb is a symbolic representation of the cosmosa visual metaphor for life emerging from darkness. Or maybe it's a stylized blueprint, passed down through priestly lineages, its purpose long since lost. Or maybe it's both. Because if there's one thing we've learned about ancient Egypt, it's that they didn't separate the scientific from the sacred. Their rituals were engineering, their myths were mechanics. A pyramid was both tomb and telescope, A temple was both shrine and calendar. And a bulb? Maybe it was just a symbol. Maybe it was more. And just when you think you've deciphered that image, found the line between meaning and machina, another mystery reaches across borders and centuries to shatter that illusion. Because 1,000 kilometers away, in the ruins of an ancient city outside modern-day Israel, a fragment of a statue has emerged. Not just any statue. A sphinx. A claw. A piece of Egypt found far from the Nile, buried in a land that should not have had it. And the question is no longer just what the Egyptians built. It's who they gave it to. If giant light bulbs carved in stone haven't lit up your curiosity yet, the next mystery just might. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's buried deeper down this rabbit hole. And tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's see how far and wide the mystery spreads. The Sphinx claws in Israel. In the ruins of Tel Hazorah site, often overshadowed by its biblical significance, archaeologists were not expecting to find Egypt, but Egypt found them. Hazor, located in modern-day northern Israel, was once a sprawling Canaanite city, a center of trade and political intrigue during the Late Bronze Age. Its name echoes in ancient texts, in the Book of Joshua, where it is burned, in Egyptian records where it appears on tribute lists. It was a city that lived in the gravitational pull of greater empires. One of them, unmistakably, was Egypt. In 2013, a team led by Dr. Amnon Ben-Tor unearthed something shocking, a pair of limestone paws. Not animal bones, not generic statuary. These were carved, massive, stylized. They were the forepaws of a sphinx, not a lion statue. A sphinx, the unmistakable symbol of pharaonic power, divine kingship, and monumental architecture. The claws bore an inscription. It named a pharaoh, and not just any pharaoh, Menkaure. Yes, that Menkaure, the builder of the third and smallest pyramid at Giza, the same Old Kingdom ruler, whose image adorns one of the most iconic triads in Egyptian sculpture, flanked by Hathor and a regional goddess. His sphinx, or at least part of it, was sitting in the soil of a ruined Canaanite city over 1,000 kilometers from Giza. Cue the collective gasp of everyone who thinks Egyptian power ended at the Nile. This wasn't a small token, not a shard or trinket. These paws were monumental. They suggested the original statue would have stood over 1.5 meters high, perhaps much taller, depending on its position and base. It had been deliberately transported, placed, and, at some point, broken. And here's where things spiral from curious to outright mysterious. How did it get there? The distance alone is formidable. From Giza to Hazor, you're crossing deserts, river systems, and hostile territories. Even in the best of times, moving something that large would have required a coordinated expedition, skilled laborers, and military or political escort. This was not an accidental export. So let's ask the obvious question. Why would an Old Kingdom monument be in a Canaanite city during the Late Bronze Age 1,000 years later? There are three possible answers. The first is trade. Egypt traded far and wide, especially during its imperial height in the New Kingdom. Gifts were sent to vassal kings, tribute flowed from conquered territories, and diplomatic relations were often sealed with luxury item statues, gold, lapis lazuli, fine linen. Perhaps the Sphinx was a diplomatic gift sent to Hazor's ruling class as a symbol of alliance. That seems plausible until you look at the dating. Menkaure ruled around 2,500 BCE. Hazor flourished under Egyptian influence more than 1,000 years later. There's no evidence that the statue was carved recently in Menkaure's name as a commemorative piece. The style and inscription are consistent with Old Kingdom craftsmanship. If this was a gift, it was a very old one. The second theory is conquest. Perhaps the Sphinx was looted. Hazor had periods of tension with Egypt, despite their ties. It may have been that an Egyptian statue was captured during a campaign and brought back as a Trophian ironic reversal of power. But this too has issues. Egyptian military campaigns into Canaan were usually about subjugation, not looting. Egyptian temples and monuments were sacred. Desecrating them even as trophies was rare, especially for something as symbolically loaded as a Sphinx. And that brings us to the third theory: pilgrimage. Not spiritual, but political. Egypt's influence in the Levant was not static. It rose and fell over centuries, woven into the fabric of shifting alliances, economic dependencies, and shared religious motifs. A high-ranking official, perhaps an Egyptian governor stationed in Canaan, or a local ruler married into an Egyptianized dynasty might have commissioned the transfer of a statue from Giza to Hazor, not as a gift, not as loot, but as a sign of legitimacy. Imagine a throne room in Hazor, its columns echoing Egyptian design, with the Sphinx of Menkaure flanking the dais. Not just art. Authority. This wasn't just a piece of Egypt, it was Egypt's presence, carved in stone, anchoring foreign soil. But then, something changed. At some point, the statue was smashed. Deliberately. The paws were found separate from the body, which has yet to be discovered. The break was violent, intentional, like a symbol defaced. And that adds another layer. Who destroyed it? Was it the invading Israelites, as the biblical narrative suggests? Was it a rival Canaanite faction rising up against Egyptian loyalists? Or was it internal, a change in ruling ideology that demanded the erasure of past allegiances? We may never know, but the message is clear. The Sphinx was no ordinary artifact. Its presence in Hazor rewrites what we thought we knew about Egypt's reach. Because if parts of Giza were being transplanted to the Levant during the Bronze Age, the lines between Egyptian and Canaanite blur. It suggests not just trade or tribute, but cultural fusion, cross-pollination of iconography and influence. Egypt wasn't just exporting grain and papyrus. It was exporting power. Stone by stone, claw by claw. And just when you think this mystery is about geopolitics and statues, you find yourself standing at the mouth of another tomb. Not a king, not a priest, a queen. Unknown, unnamed, but buried with the honors of a sovereign. A woman whose death was remembered, but whose name was erased. And her silence might be louder than all the monuments combined. The identity of the unknown queen. In 2015, buried beneath the sands of Abu Sira necropolis, not far from Cairo and long associated with Egypt's 5th Dynasty, a team of Czech archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. It wasn't the grandeur of the tomb that stunned them. It was the question inside it. Because within that rectangular limestone structure, carved into bedrock, wrapped in centuries of stillness, they found the remains of a woman. Not just any woman. A woman interred with the ceremonial hallmarks of royalty. Elaborate jewelry, delicately crafted alabaster vessels, inscriptions invoking solar deities, and a name that was missing. No cartouche, no clear inscription, no wall reliefs. Nothing. And yet, everything about the tomb screamed status. This was not the burial of a priestess. This was a queen's grave, but a queen with no name. The only reference carved into the stone called her wife of the king and mother of the king. That's it. 2 titles. No identity. And so she became the unknown queen. Cue the unraveling of every assumption we've held about Egypt's dynastic chronology. Let's break it down. The 5th dynasty, circa 2494–2345 BCE, was a time of innovation and ideological transition. The rulers of this era shifted religious focus toward the sun god Ra, building solar temples and emphasizing divine connection over brute monumentality. The pyramid complex of Nefertiti, located nearby, helped narrow down the time frame of the queen's burial, placing her between the reigns of Nefertiti and Nusere, which leads to the first major theory, that she was the wife of Nefertiti and the mother of Nusere. That would make her a queen regent, a powerful figure during one of Egypt's most fluid and politically tense transitions. And if that's true, her anonymity becomes even stranger, because Egyptian queens, especially those who bore heirs, were rarely forgotten. Queen Khenkaus I, for instance, was glorified in monumental tombs and inscriptions, even depicted wearing the false beard of pharaohs. Her probable granddaughter, Khenkaus II, received similar treatment. These women didn't just support dynasties, they created them. So why not this queen? Why is her name missing from history? One possibility is deliberate erasure. Egypt had its own form of damnatio memoriae, erasing names, chiseling out titles, defacing images. It was typically reserved for enemies of the state or disgraced royals. Could this queen have been involved in a political schism? Perhaps she supported the wrong heir. Perhaps she ruled too openly in a time when royal women were expected to wield power in shadows. Another theory? Her son's reign was so brief, so chaotic, that she never received a full funerary program, a rushed burial, a tomb completed without final inscriptions. But even that doesn't fully explain the richness of her burial, the expensive grave goods, the intricately carved sarcophagus, the solar motifs linking her to divine kingship. And here's where the story deepens. Among the artifacts found in her tomb were seal impressions bearing the names of several high-ranking official scribes, treasurers, and priests. These men didn't serve minor figures. They served the throne, which means this burial wasn't a forgotten accident. It was state-sanctioned. It was known. It was acknowledged. And yet, she remains nameless. What if she wasn't forgotten? What if she was hidden? There's a theory on that's speculative but increasingly compelling that suggests this queen might have been more than a consort. She may have ruled, not just as regent but as sovereign. The Fifth Dynasty was a time of religious restructuring. The cult of Ra was rising in prominence. Power was shifting from Memphis to Heliopolis. And in the midst of this upheaval, a queen wielding both matrilineal authority and political savvy might have served as the crucial bridge between dynasties. Her power may have been inconvenient or threatening. Her name might have been intentionally left out to prevent her from overshadowing her Sona from being remembered as a ruler in her own right. After all, in a society where history was carved in stone, silence is a choice. But the bones don't lie. Forensic analysis of the remains suggests a woman in her mid to late 30s, at the time of death, well-nourished, no signs of trauma. She likely died of natural causes, and she was buried quickly, but with care. Her body was placed in a sarcophagus of fine limestone, the kind reserved for the elite. Amulets were placed around her chest. Her arms were crossed in the pose reserved for queens and priestesses of high status. This wasn't an afterthought. It was a message, a whisper of sovereignty veiled in obscurity. And still, the question lingers. What was her name? Was she a forgotten Khenkaus? A lost daughter of a sun king? A transitional monarch who stabilized the dynasty between Nefertiti and Nusere, only to be erased once power consolidated? Or was she the founder of a hidden lineal woman whose son's brief reign flickered before vanishing, leaving her with the titles of both mother and widow but no legacy? There's another possibility, unorthodox but haunting. She may have been foreign. The Fifth Dynasty saw increasing contact with regions to the east, Byblos, Canaan, Nubia. Marriages were sometimes arranged to cement alliances. If she were a foreign bride elevated to queen, her omission from monuments might have been political a decision to obscure foreign influence within the royal bloodline. we'll likely never know for certain. But what we do know is this. Someone made sure she was buried with honor. Someone ensured that even without a name, she would be remembered in ritual. And in doing so, they preserved the paradox, a queen acknowledged by title, yet denied identity. A woman both present and absent, seen but unnamed. And as you stand before her empty cartouche, you begin to understand the true weight of Egyptian silence and know just what it says, but what it refuses to say. She is a void in the record, a gap in the lineage, a blank space carved in stone. And yet, her story doesn't end here. Because just a few kilometers away, another void has been found, this one not in a name, but in the architecture of Egypt's most iconic monument. A chamber so large it defies explanation. So hidden, it eluded discovery for 4,500 years. And it lies, waiting, inside the Great Pyramid. The unseen hidden chamber of the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid of Giza Khufu's grand legacy, Earth's most iconic monument, and the largest single structure ever built by human hands before the industrial eras, for all its glory, a riddle. It is a triangle cast in limestone, a 6 million ton mountain forged from over 2.3 million blocks. Every stone is positioned with such precision that even modern laser measurements fail to explain how ancient masons achieved it. Its base is almost perfectly level. Its sides align nearly exactly with the cardinal directions. And for centuries, we believed we knew all there was to know about it. Until 2017. That year, scientists working with the Scan Pyramids project, a collaboration between Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities, the Heritage Innovation Preservation Institute, and a team of international physicists announced a discovery that changed everything. They had found a void, a hidden chamber. Using a technique known as muon tomography, a kind of cosmic ray imaging that allows researchers to see through solid stone, the team detected a large empty space above the Grand Gallery, a long sloping passageway that leads up toward the king's chamber. This wasn't a small cavity or crack. It was a chamber the size of a cathedral, roughly 30 meters long. That's longer than the Grand Gallery itself. And it had been completely undetected for over 4 millennia. No entrance, no known passages, no writings, no tools, no evidence of how to get in nor what might lie inside. The scientific community was stunned. The general public? Electrified? Because this wasn't speculation. It wasn't a myth. It wasn't a fringe theory. It was real. A massive, man-made space, concealed in the heart of the most studied monument on Earth, and no one knows why it's there. Let's start with the basics. The Great Pyramid contains 3 known chambers: the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and an unfinished subterranean room carved into bedrock. Above the King's Chamber are 5 small, relieving chambers, designed to distribute the immense weight of the stones above. These have been known since the 19th century. But the newly discovered void lies much higher above the Grand Gallery, and its size and orientation make it unlike any other structural element. Which raises the question, is it a functional void or a symbolic one? Some archaeologists suggest it might be a stress relief chamber, created to reduce weight on the Grand Gallery. But that theory doesn't hold up well. The location is awkward, the volume is excessive. And most importantly, the ancient Egyptians didn't build voids that big unless they served a purpose. So what could that purpose be? Let's explore the possibilities. First, the ceremonial. The Great Pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a ritual engine. Every measurement, angle, and alignment was intentional. The King's Chamber is lined with granite, resonant, and acoustically sensitive. The entire structure may have served as a resurrection machine designed to propel the pharaoh's soul into the afterlife via celestial mechanics. Could the hidden chamber be part of that system? Some researchers think so. They've theorized that the chamber may have housed a secret ritual space, a symbolic ark, or even a repository of sacred relics. A kind of inner sanctum, hidden not just from enemies, but from time itself. Others think it could be a burial cache Khufu's real tomb, undiscovered because the so-called King's Chamber was a decoy. It's not an outlandish idea. The Valley of the Kings is filled with false chambers and misleading tunnels. Deception was part of the architectural strategy. And then there are the extreme theories. Hidden records, Atlantean technology, alien storage units. These make headlines, but rarely hold academic weight. Still, the fact remains, no theory, fringe or mainstream, can fully explain why such a large chamber would be hidden so deeply, so precisely, and so successfully for thousands of years. Let's take a moment to appreciate the stealth of this structure. The pyramid has been explored, measured, and dissected since the time of the Greeks. Robbers tunneled through it. Napoleon's engineers mapped it. Modern scanners have combed its surface with radar and sonar. And yet this void, this massive architectural secret escaped them all. Only cosmic rays, particles from deep space, revealed its presence. It's like the pyramid waited for technology to catch up, for science to look up, not down. And still, the chamber remains out of reach. There is, as of yet, no physical access. No robot has entered it. No fiber optic camera has snaked its way inside. The stone around it is dense and sacred. No one wants to be the archaeologist who drills into Khufu's monument and shatters its legacy. But the pressure is mounting, because the longer it stays sealed, the louder the theories become. Some suggest the chamber may have housed Khufu's Ka, his life force, not a body, but a metaphysical presence. Others believe it could be an unfinished structuria mistake. But the Egyptians didn't make structural mistakes this large. They didn't accidentally carve cathedral-sized voids above precision-engineered galleries. If it was built, it was meant to be there. And if it was meant to be there, it meant something. Even the geometry tells a story. The chamber's position aligns with known architectural stress points, but also with celestial lines traced in the pyramid texts that describe the pharaoh's ascension to the stars, his journey to join the circumpolar gods. Could this be where that journey was supposed to begin? A launch chamber for the soul? A celestial chamber built not for eyes but for spirits? We don't know. But what we do know is that the Great Pyramid still isn't finished speaking. For centuries, we treated it like a solved equation. A monument explained, a tomb explored. But now, the void has reopened the mystery. What else lies hidden? What other chambers await discovery? What secrets sleep inside the limestone heart of Egypt's most enduring enigma? And if that chamber holds nothing but emptiness, even that is something. A silence built to last forever. But while we wait for someone to crack the code of the Great Pyramid's hidden heart, Egypt has other voids to offer pharaohs not carved into stone, but time. Because before this pyramid ever rose, there was a kingdom, a golden age. And then it stopped. Abruptly, silently, and no one knows exactly why. The sudden end of the Old Kingdom. For 500 years, the Old Kingdom of Egypt was a miracle in motion. It was a time of colossal ambition of pyramids that touched the sky and dynasties that seemed eternal. It was the age of Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, of Djoser's step pyramid, and Sneferu's engineering experiments. The state was centralized. The Nile flowed predictably. Priests and administrators filed papyrus records like clockwork. Art flourished. Law held. And then, around 2181 BCE, it all stopped. No war, no invasion, no city burned to the ground. Just silence. The fifth dynasty gave way to the sixth, and somewhere in the long reign of Pepi, too arguably, the longest reign of any pharaoh in history, something fractured. After Pepi's death, the structure of Egypt crumbled into what scholars call the First Intermediate Period, a stretch of chaos, decentralization, and cultural regression. But why? Why did a civilization that mastered monumentality, controlled floods, and stabilized a vast bureaucracy simply break? The truth is, we still don't know. But the theories are as compelling as the pyramids they try to explain. Let's start with climate. One of the leading theories is environmental collapse. Studies of sediment cores from the Nile Delta and the Eastern Mediterranean reveal a pattern of drought beginning around 2200 BCE. This wasn't just a dry spell, it was a climate event. Known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, it affected regions from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Rain patterns shifted, Nile inundations failed. And when the Nile failed, Egypt starved. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the kingdom's bloodstream. Each year, its floodwaters brought fertile silt to the farmlands. Every pyramid, every tomb, every statue was paid for by the surplus grain it enabled. When the flood stopped, that surplus evaporated. Famine followed. Papyrus fragments from the period mention food shortages, social unrest, and officials unable to collect taxes. Tomb inscriptions hint at desperation. "I gave bread to the hungry," they declare, suggesting hunger had become common. Even the architecture changed. Monumental construction ground to a halt. Tombs grew smaller. Decorative art became less intricate. The economy, once a granite behemoth, began to crack. But drought alone doesn't explain the collapse. Plenty of ancient societies survived climate change through trade, migration, or internal reorganization. Egypt had the infrastructure, the bureaucracy, the scribes. Why didn't it adapt? The second theory, political decentralization. Pepi II's reign was a double-edged sword. He ruled for over 90 years, ascending the throne as a child and dying as a centenarian. While that sounds impressive, it left a power vacuum. A single long reign means multiple generations of would-be successors die before taking the throne. It creates succession crises, bureaucratic stagnation, and the entrenchment of local power. Nomarchs' regional governors began acting like independent lords. Temples accrued wealth. The balance of power shifted away from the pharaoh. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, Egypt was no longer a kingdom, it was a patchwork. The royal court in Memphis couldn't enforce policy beyond its shadow. Provinces collected taxes and kept them. The old command economy, so crucial to pyramid building, dissolved. Without central oversight, granaries went unstocked. Roads fell into disrepair. Communication between nomes, the administrative regions, slowed or stopped. In effect, Egypt balkanized. No single event caused the collapse. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. And then came the ripple effects. Tomb robbing spiked, priestly authority weakened. The mortuary cults that sustained the dead pharaohs decayed. Inscriptions from the First Intermediate Period are filled with lamentations. Inscriptions from the First Intermediate Period are filled with lamentations. It wasn't just economic collapse, it was social inversion. The world had turned upside down. And yet, not completely. Even amid the turmoil, Egypt didn't vanish. Regional rulers kept administrative systems alive. Art continued, though cruder. Religion adapted. New theological ideas emerged, the democratization of the afterlife, where commoners could aspire to immortality once reserved for kings. It's as if the collapse cracked the outer shell, but the core endured. Eventually, the Middle Kingdom emerged, born from Theban reunification and led by strong rulers like Mentuhotep II, who reasserted control and restored central authority. But the trauma left its mark. The Grand Pyramids were never built again at the same scale. The pharaoh's power would never again be as unquestioned. Egypt had learned that even the divine king could fall. And here's where the mystery deepens. Because there are gaps, literal and figurative. Archaeological records from the end of the Old Kingdom are scarce. Written texts are fragmentary. Large swaths of papyrus archives are missing. It's as if the memory of the collapse was intentionally forgotten, buried beneath layers of later propaganda. Was there civil war? Was there plague? Or something darker? Some fringe theorists point to astronomical events, solar flares, meteor impacts, cosmic alignments. Others suggest that secret cults or foreign agents destabilized the monarchy. But the truth is probably more mundane and more terrifying. The system simply outgrew itself. It built too big, too fast, too centralized. The very thing that made the Old Kingdom a marvel, its obsession with permanence, made it vulnerable to change. When the Nile shifted, when the king aged, when the provinces stopped listening, the machine collapsed under its own weight. And the pyramids became silent. No longer symbols of power, but warnings. Monuments to a civilization that believed it could master eternity and was reminded, painfully, that nothing lasts forever. But if the fall of the Old Kingdom shows us the fragility of centralized power, the next mystery throws us into the chaos that followed. A chaos that came not from within but from the sea. Unknown warriors, shattered empires, and a name that echoes like thunder across the ruins of the ancient world. The Sea Peoples invasion. In the twilight years of the Late Bronze Age, civilizations began to fall like dominoes. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Mycenaean palaces went up in flames. Ugarit was reduced to rubble, its tablets charred mid-message, and Eternal Egypt stood alone in the smoke. At the heart of this continental cataclysm, an enigma emerged. They came from the sea. They came in ships. They came with fire and iron. They are known only as the Sea Peoples. The name is a modern construct, a catch-all phrase for one of the most mysterious and destructive forces to ever descend upon the Mediterranean world. We do not know where they came from. We do not know their language. We do not know their real names. But we know what they did. They erased an age. The evidence begins with the Egyptians themselves. Pharaoh Ramesses III, in his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, proudly displays a sprawling relief of his victory over these invaders. The inscriptions call them foreigners from the sea, identifying several tribes by name: the Peliset, Jeker, Denyen, Shardana, Shekelesh. Some of those names ring ancient bells. The Peliset are often linked to the Philistines. The Denyen sounds suspiciously like the Danaans of Homeric fame. The Shardana, possibly Sardinians. The Shekelesh, perhaps Sicilians. The Jeker, a mystery still. But whether these were ethnonyms, tribal designations, or simply labels applied by Egyptian scribes to unknown peoples, one thing is certain. They brought the Bronze Age to its knees. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a tightly interconnected web of empires, trade routes, and diplomatic marriages. Goods flowed from Cyprus to Crete, from Egypt to Anatolia. Letters passed between kings. Armies supported each other. Palaces boomed with luxury. Then came fire. Cities along the Levantine coast fell one by one. Alalakh, Arzawa, Troy, Carchemish. The Hittites, who once stood as equals to Egypt, vanished almost overnight. Their capital, Hattusa, was abandoned and forgotten. Mycenaean Greece descended into centuries of silence, the so-called Greek Dark Ages. Even Ugarit, a cosmopolitan trade hub and literate society, was obliterated so quickly that a scribe's final message was still in the oven when the city fell. The enemy ships are already here. Only Egypt withstood the storm, but just barely. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe a great sea battle where Ramesses III claims to have crushed the invaders with fire and fury. The reliefs show massive naval confrontations, Egyptian archers standing firm as ships collide and burn. It's cinematic, heroic, but the cost was enormous. Even in victory, Egypt began to shrink. Trade routes collapsed, grain shipments faltered. Tomb robbing became rampant. Central authority wavered. The empire would never reach its previous heights again. So who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? There are several theories, none fully satisfying. The first is migration. Some scholars believe the Sea Peoples were displaced populations victims of famine, drought, or conflict who took to the sea in search of new lands. Climate data supports this. The 13th and 12th centuries BCE saw increasing aridity across the Mediterranean. Crop failures may have driven desperate peoples to seek refuge or conquest. The second theory is rebellion. Perhaps the Sea Peoples weren't outsiders at all, but the disaffected mercenaries, vassals, and client states of the major powers. The Shardana, for instance, appear earlier as elite bodyguards of pharaohs. The Denyen may have once served the Hittites. Could the very backbone of Bronze Age militaries have turned against their masters? The third theory, a confederation of pirates and raiders. With weakened navies and vulnerable coastlines, the Mediterranean may have devolved into chaos. Opportunistic bands, joined by shared desperation rather than ethnicity, could have formed temporary alliances. Less an army, more a swarm. And then there's the cultural hybrid theory. Some archaeologists suggest the Sea Peoples weren't a single entity at all, but a domino effect. As one region collapsed, its survivors moved to the next, igniting further instability. Refugees became raiders. Defenders became invaders. In this view, the Sea Peoples are not a cause of the collapse, but a symptom. A perfect storm of upheaval. But there are still mysteries. For one, the scale. The destruction left in their wake was near total. Fortified cities with centuries of defense planning fell in weeks. Burn layers at archaeological sites are eerily synchronized across vast distances. Entire scripts, linear B, cuneiform dialects went extinct. Languages died. Crafts disappeared. The economic system that had linked 3 continents imploded. This was not a small disruption. This was civilizational reset. And still, they left no cities, no inscriptions, no monuments, no empire. They swept through history like a ghost wave. The only visual record we have is from their enemies the Medinet Habu reliefs, where the Sea Peoples are depicted with feathered headdresses, round shields, and ox-driven carts. Their ships have distinctive bird-headed prows. Their warriors are stocky, bearded, heavily armed. But the images raise more questions than they answer. Were they one people? Or many? Why did they disappear after such devastation? Did they settle in Canaan, become the Philistines, and integrate into local politics? Did they fragment into smaller tribes, swallowed by history? Or were they, perhaps, never meant to last? A force of chaos sent to cleanse the old world of its excesses? The Sea Peoples remain a phantom menace everywhere and nowhere. Their arrival marked the end of the Bronze Age. Their departure left silence in their wake. And yet, Egypt endured. Barely. But it remembered. And the memory was etched in stone, on temple walls, in verses of divine wrath. Because Egypt always remembers, even when others forget. But memory is a fickle thing, because even as the Sea Peoples disappear into the dark, the gaps they left behind reveal another kind of mystery, not about the people who vanished, but about the records they took with them. Steles broken, names missing, timelines fractured. And nowhere is this more apparent than in one of Egypt's strangest historical documents, a stone so precious, its fragments still dictate what we think we know about the earliest days of kingship. It is shattered, incomplete, and dangerously quiet in the places that matter most. It is the Palermo stone, the Palermo stone lacune. It's no larger than a laptop screen, a piece of black basalt inscribed with fine hieroglyphs, polished smooth by hands that lived more than 4,000 years ago. But what it holds, sir, more precisely, what it no longer holds is the fragile scaffolding of Egyptian chronology. This is the Palermo stone, or rather, a fragment of it. Discovered in the 19th century and currently housed at the Palermo Archaeological Museum in Sicily, this artifact is one of the most tantalizing and frustrating relics of ancient Egyptian historiography. It's part of what scholars call the Royal Annals, a monumental stela that once recorded the reigns of Egypt's earliest kings spanning from the mythical pre-dynastic rulers to the end of the 5th dynasty. But here's the problem. It's broken, shattered, and the most important pieces are missing. Let's break it down. The Palermo stone was originally a large slab, possibly up to 2 meters wide, covered in neat horizontal rows of hieroglyphs, each line chronicling a king's reign year by year. Each entry includes not just the king's name and length of reign, but also the year names themselves, short descriptions of events significant enough to define a calendar year. Year of the first cattle count. Year of the smiting of the eastern desert. Year of building the canal to the sea. These aren't just royal PR slogans. They're windows into the administrative soul of the kingdom. Taxation, warfare, infrastructure, diplomacy. But those windows are cracked, and in many cases, gone. Of the original stela, only 7 fragments are known today. 1 in Palermo, 5 in Cairo, and 1 in London. Together, they form a jigsaw puzzle of historics. Except most of the puzzle pieces are missing, and there's no box to show the final image. Worse still, the most tantalizing lacuna gaps in the text are precisely where they shouldn't. The early dynasties. The shadowy rulers before Narmer. The figures that straddle the line between myth and monarchy. In those sections, the lines falter, the names blur, whole reigns vanish into smoothed-over silence. What's left are tantalizing hints. Kings whose names we can't fully read. Events whose meaning we can't decode. A timeline that feels more like a ghost story than a ledger. And this is where the real mystery begins. Because the Palermo stone isn't just a historical document, it's a contradiction in stone. It presents the illusion of precision dates, events, names, yet crumbles into ambiguity when we need it most. It suggests that Egypt's early history was well recorded, yet the loss of just a few fragments renders whole centuries opaque. So what happened? Some scholars blame time. Basalt, though hard, is brittle. The stone may have been broken during transport, or during periods of iconoclasm. Later rulers, like Akhenaten or the Roman occupiers, might have deemed it irrelevant or offensive. At some point, the stela shattered, and the pieces scattered across the globe. But others suspect something more intentional. Why are the earliest kings the most obscured? Why do the names just before the first dynasty read like allegories? Scorpion, falcon, bull. Could it be that those early kings were never kings at all, but mythologized tribal chieftains elevated into the divine record? Or were they real, flesh-and-blood rulers whose deeds were so foundational or so dangerous that later dynasties sought to obscure them? There's also the theory of religious censorship. As Egyptian theology evolved, especially under the priesthoods of Ra and later Amun, older cosmologies and ancestral narratives may have been edited out of the official record. The Palermo stone could have been caught in that crossfire either, deliberately damaged or selectively forgotten. The result? We're left with a record that's simultaneously the most important and the least complete. And it matters. Because the Palermo stone isn't just a list. It's a timeline, a spine. Without it, our entire understanding of Egypt's early dynastic period is built on inference, guesswork, and cross-referenced inscriptions from tombs, potsherds, and the occasional surviving papyrus. Worse, it affects how we view Egyptian chronology as a whole. When did Narmer unify the two lands? How long did kings like Den or Jer reign? What events shaped the transition from pre-dynastic tribes to an empire that would last 3,000 years? We don't know. Not fully. And the Palermo stone's silence on these questions is deafening. But there's something poetic in its destruction. It reminds us that history is not permanent, that even stone forgets, that even kings can vanish. And yet, the stone persists. Its fragments are still studied, scanned, and digitized. Scholars pore over every glyph, comparing them to other annalistic texts like the Turin King List or the Abydos King List, each with their own omissions, their own edits. And the gaps? They're not empty. They're invitations. Invitations to imagine, to reconstruct, to ask, what was erased? What was never written? And what lies between the lines? Because sometimes, the most dangerous knowledge is the kind that's almost remembered. And as we chase these gaps back to Egypt's dawn, we find ourselves staring at a new contradiction. Another king list. This one more intact, but filled with deliberate omissions. Pharaohs struck from history not by time, but by choice. Because when a king no longer serves the story removes the king. Welcome to Abydos, the Abydos King List Inconsistencies. In a dim corridor within the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, chiseled deep into a limestone wall, a sacred lineage parades in perfect procession. 76 pharaohs march in carved stone, their names inscribed in carefully arranged cartouches, framed by lotus and papyrus, watched over by Seti and his son Ramesses II. This is the Abydos King List. It is beautiful. It is reverent. And it is a lie. Because while it presents itself as a complete, unbroken genealogy of divine kingship from Menes, the legendary unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, through the pharaohs of the New Kingdom it omits dozens of rulers. Entire dynasties disappear. And the omissions are not random. They are deliberate. Let's start with what the list is. Carved during the reign of Seti I in the 13th century BCE, the list was intended as a ritual affirmation of the king's legitimacy's connection to the divine past, and his place within the sacred continuity of Egypt. The names are presented in 2 rows, flanked by Seti and Ramesses offering incense to their royal ancestors. But here's what's missing. The entire second intermediate period gone. All the Hyksos kings erased. The heretic pharaoh Akhenaten vanished. His successors, Smenkhkare, Tutenkhamun, and Ayalso absent. Even the powerful female pharaoh Hatshepsut, one of the most successful and innovative rulers in Egyptian history, is nowhere to be found. It's not a clerical error. It's political surgery. The Abydos King List is not history. It's propaganda. A curated narrative. A sacred script edited for ideology. Because in Egypt, kingship wasn't just political, it was cosmological. The pharaoh was Ma'at incarnate, the axis between gods and men. If a ruler disrupted that balance by usurping power, inviting foreign rule, or challenging the religious orthodoxy, they didn't just lose legitimacy. They lost existence. They were unwritten. Akhenaten, for instance, committed the greatest sin in the eyes of his successors. He changed the gods. During his reign, he abolished Egypt's traditional pantheon and installed Aten, the sun disk, as the sole deity. He moved the capital to Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, abandoned the temples of Amun, and rewrote liturgies. His reign lasted only 17 years, but its shockwaves lasted centuries. After his death, Egypt snapped back to orthodoxy with ferocity. Temples were reopened. Old gods were reinstated. And Akhenaten's name was scraped from every monument, every record, every wall. The Abydos king list reflects that purge. He is not mentioned. He never existed. Except, of course, he did. So did Hatshepsut, who ruled as king not queen, donning the false beard, claiming divine birth, and commissioning massive building projects like her temple at Deir el-Bahri. But her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, later attempted to erase her memory, defacing her statues, removing her name from inscriptions, replacing her images with his own. The Abydos list complies. She's gone. So what does that say about history in ancient Egypt? That it was always a performance. A curated continuity. Not a record, but a ritual. The list at Abydos wasn't carved for posterity. It was carved for the gods, for the future. To present a version of the past that supported the present ruler's claim to divine legitimacy. Which makes it less a genealogy and more a manifesto. And yet, despite its omissions, the Abydos king list remains one of the most valuable chronological tools we have. It's one of the few documents that attempts to catalog rulers in sequential order, connecting myth to monarchy, legend to lineage. Its absences are as telling as its inclusions. They reveal which rulers were considered legitimate and which were not. They show us how history was weaponized, used to bolster the power of some and obliterate the legacy of others. But the contradictions don't stop there. Other king lists like the Tutenkhamun, found on a fragmentary papyrus, or the Saqqara list, carved in the tomb of Chunaroy, tell different stories. They include names that Abydos does not. They correct its omissions, but introduce new ones of their own. It's as if each list is telling a different version of the same dream. And we're left to guess which version, if any, is real. So why does this matter? Because Egypt's entire historical framework, our chronology of pharaohs, battles, monuments, and innovations rests on a foundation of curated memory, a memory that is sometimes more interested in myth than truth. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the treatment of rulers whose power was inconvenient, whose lineage was uncertain, or whose theology was considered blasphemous. To study Egypt is to study history at war with itself. A nation that both preserved and erased. That built monuments to permanence and then chiseled them clean. The Abydos king list is not just a record. It is an act of erasure. A statement about who deserved to be remembered and who deserved to vanish. But stone forgets nothing forever. Akhenaten's ruins were found. Hatshepsut's obelisks still rise. Tutenkhamun's tomb, undisturbed for millennia, rewrote the narrative with gold. And so, the gaps in the list are less a failure of record than a symptom of control. Control over time, over memory, over narrative. Which brings us to an even deeper mystery. Because while kings and queens could be deleted, structures remained. Temples stood. And within those temples, there are chambers, some massive, some minor, whose functions are still unknown. Rooms without names. Carvings without explanation. Architectural features that defy classification. They are not secret, but they are unsolved. And they are everywhere. The function of certain temple structures. Step into any major Egyptian temple, Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, Dendera, and you'll find a universe in stone. Each structure is a cosmos, laid out according to sacred geometry, aligned to celestial rhythms, and embedded with theological symbolism. Every wall speaks, every column has a name. The temple was not just a building, it was a living being, a divine body where each room had a soul. And yet, some rooms remain silent. Small, dark chambers tucked into corners, long, narrow corridors that lead nowhere, isolated antechambers with no apparent function, carved niches with no statues, bas-reliefs that defy translation. Temple features that seem intentional, perfectly built, precisely oriented, but resist explanation. They are the ghosts of purpose. And Egyptologists are still trying to decipher their meaning. Let's start with Karnak. The Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak is the largest religious complex ever constructed. Over 2 square kilometers of pylons, obelisks, chapels, and halls. A city of gods made from sandstone. And within that vast structure lies a particularly strange feature, a series of crypts, sealed, unlit, narrow chambers buried deep within the temple core. Some are too small for human use, some appear to have never been opened, yet they are not random. Their placement suggests deliberation. Their walls, where accessible, are sometimes undecorated, other times etched with esoteric symbols. What were these rooms for? One theory is that they were ritual storage spaces, vaults for cult objects, sacred texts, or oracular devices. Another posits that they were sound chambers designed to create resonance during specific rites. A third suggests they functioned as spirit traps, architectural anomalies meant to bind and contain divine energies summoned during temple rituals. Each theory makes sense, and none explain everything. Then there's the false doors. Found in nearly every major temple and tomb, these doors are not functional. They do not open. They do not lead anywhere. But they are carved with incredible care, inscribed with offerings and invocations, and sometimes painted to simulate wood and bronze hinges. The conventional interpretation is symbolic. These are portals for the Kaith Solto pass between the world of the living and the divine. But some are positioned in ways that defy ritual access. Hidden, obscured, buried. Were they meant to be used? Seen? Heard? Consider the mummies, or birth houses, found at Dendera and Edfu. These are small, ornate structures typically attached to larger temple complexes dedicated to the divine birth of a god or king. But their internal features, tight corridors, double sanctuaries, rooftop platforms, suggest a ritual complexity that exceeds a simple nativity scene. Their walls are filled with cryptic symbolism. Horus nursing at Isis's breast, deities purifying the newborn king, star charts overlaid with hymns. Were these theological theaters? Astronomical calculators? Or initiatory chambers for priests acting out the cosmos? No definitive answer has emerged. Because Egyptian temples weren't just houses of worship. They were machines. Machines of time, of energy, of narrative. They mapped the sun's path, mirrored the sky, replicated the mythic cycle of death and rebirth. And within these machines were cogs, whose purpose may have been known only to the highest priests, individuals bound by vows of secrecy, trained through decades of esoteric learning. And when those priests died, so did the instructions. Let's return to Dendera. The Temple of Hathor is one of the best preserved complexes in Egypt. Its ceilings still retain vibrant astronomical reliefs. Its walls are covered in hymns, rites, lists of sacred oils. And hidden within it is a small, subterranean room, the crypt, where the famous Dendera light reliefs were found. But beyond the light bulb controversy lies another oddity. The access shaft to this chamber is absurdly narrow. The stairs are steep, the angle claustrophobic. It is not meant for casual traffic. No part of it feels public. Whatever was done here Whatever was stored or enacted was meant to be hidden. And the room itself? It is too small for ritual procession, too ornate for storage, too deliberate to be forgotten. This paradox repeats throughout temple architecture. In Luxor, side chapels show patterns of wear that suggest repeated use, but for what, we don't know. At Edfu, doors open into rooms without decoration, but with acoustics that amplify whispers. At Philae, architectural anomalies appear at solar alignments, yet the rituals associated with them are lost. Were these rooms used once a year? Once a lifetime? Were they spaces for initiation, isolation, invocation? Or were they components of a larger mystery ritualone that bound the temple to the rhythms of the stars? One theory suggests that some of these structures were tied to temple magic, a series of ritual technologies designed to maintain cosmic balance. Temples weren't just reflections of the universe. They were tools to manipulate it, to recalibrate time, to cleanse the divine essence of the pharaoh, to anchor celestial cycles in stone. In this light, the empty rooms weren't empty. They were dormant, like switches on a circuit board, activated only under specific conditions, dates, sounds, incantations, smells, ritual variables we no longer possess. And that's the crux of the mystery. The architecture remains, but the operating system is gone. We can walk the halls, measure the angles, read the inscriptions, but the full ritual code, lived experience of the temple is beyond recovery. Or almost. Because Egypt has left us more than stones. It has left us maps, lists, biographies, and sometimes it has left us absences. The empty rooms, the dead-end corridors, the too small sanctuaries, all suggest a hidden layer of temple life, one reserved not for the gods or even the priests, but for those whose memory no longer remains. Like the high officials whose names we know from texts, but whose grand tombs we have never found. They ruled, they served, they were honored, and then they vanished. The lost tombs of high officials. In the great mosaic of ancient Egypt, the kings and queens dominate the center. Their pyramids, their temples, their colossal statues hold court in the imagination, drawing tourists and scholars like gravity. But orbiting that center were the true engines of empire, the viziers, generals, scribes, treasurers, high priests. Men of immense power, often second only to the pharaoh, whose influence shaped the daily and divine workings of a kingdom designed to last forever. And yet many of their final resting places, the tombs they must have prepared, the monuments they surely commissioned, are gone. Not vandalized, not robbed, missing, lost. This isn't just an archaeological footnote. It's a gaping hole in our understanding of the Egyptian elite and the structures that supported royal power. Because these were not minor figures. Take Khagemni, for example, a vizier who served under both Teti and possibly Pepi I during the 6th dynasty. Khagemni was a towering figure in the administration of Memphis. His wisdom was so revered that his teachings were preserved in the Instructions of Khagemni, one of the earliest surviving works of Egyptian moral philosophy, and yet his tomb has never been definitively identified. A man entrusted with the balance of Ma'atla, order, truth forgotten by history's most meticulous builders. Then there's Maya. A high official under Tutenkhamun and Horemheb, Maya held the titles of Overseer of the Treasury and Overseer of the Works in the place of eternity. Essentially the man in charge of building royal tombs, including the Valley of the Kings. His own tomb was discovered partially at Saqqara, but only after centuries of obscurity. For decades, it was considered lost, mentioned in passing by inscriptions but never found. Even now, parts of it remain unexcavated, its secrets sealed beneath debris and shifting dunes. How does the man who buried kings go missing? Another case, Hemiunu, the architect of the Great Pyramid. nephew to Khufu, vizier, overseer of works, and high priest. His mastaba, near the Great Pyramid, was found but not intact. The sarcophagus is missing. The chamber was desecrated. Was it robbed? Was it moved? Or did Hemiunu have another tomb, a secret chamber deeper inside the monument he helped build? We don't know. And the pattern repeats. High officials with extensive titles, court records, and surviving statues figures like Imhotep, the polymath who served Djoser and was later deified, have no confirmed tombs. Imhotep, the father of medicine, architect of the Step Pyramid, and perhaps Egypt's most legendary non-royal missing. Entire lifetimes of prestige, erased in death. So what happened? There are several theories. The first is erosion literal and historical. Many of these tombs were likely constructed near Memphis, in areas like Saqqara and Dashur, where shifting sands and rising groundwater have destroyed countless structures. Tombs made of mud brick, rather than stone, vanish quickly. In time, they become indistinguishable from the desert. The second theory is tomb usurpation. During periods of decline or political upheaval, tombs were reused, repurposed, even defaced. Names were erased. Sarcophagi reinscribed. The bones of viziers may lie in tombs now attributed to other sore and unmarked shafts, stripped of identity. The third is secrecy. Some scholars believe certain high officials were buried in hidden locations, especially those who dealt with royal secrets, architects of tombs, guardians of ritual knowledge. Like the workers of Deir el-Medina who carved the Valley of the Kings, they may have been entombed in unmarked graves to prevent them from revealing forbidden details, even in death. Their anonymity was their loyalty. Their tombs were never meant to be found. And then there's the fourth theory, cultural revision. As dynasties shifted, so did ideologies. Officials associated with fallen kings may have been erased, stripped from records, their tombs left unfinished or intentionally buried. Like Akhenaten's courtiers, whose memory was damned, along with his. The result? A vast and invisible necropolis. We know they existed. We know they were powerful. We have statues of them in museums, inscriptions naming their titles, letters referencing their deeds. But their tombs are silent. And the implications are massive. Because Egyptian tombs are time capsules. They don't just hold bones, they hold rituals, blueprints, cosmologies. The absence of a tomb isn't just the absence of a grave, it's the absence of data. What architectural styles were used? What funerary texts? What grave goods? What regional variations? When a high official's tomb is lost, a chapter of Egyptian life disappears with it. And so, archaeologists continue to search. They comb Saqqara, hoping for a collapsed shaft. They scan the Theban hills, hoping for an unmarked niche. They study temple walls and coffin inscriptions, piecing together coordinates from prayers and praises. Every so often, they get close. A tomb attributed to a known official is discovered. A name is matched to a title. A sarcophagus is recovered from a forgotten shaft. But the big ones, the tombs of the architects, the engineers of empire, remain elusive. Imhotep, Khagemni, Hemiunu, Maya, Ptahhotep, titans of civilization, buried somewhere. Perhaps under roads, perhaps beneath towns, perhaps in unmarked pits, their names burned away by time or decree. Their absence reminds us that even in a land obsessed with eternity, some legacies vanish. Not by accident, but by design. And yet, even in absence, they speak. Their names survive in papyri, in granite statues, in the hearts of monuments. And sometimes, in books. One of those books, an astronomical treatise carved into sarcophagi and temple ceilings, offers a glimpse into an entirely different Egypt, one not bound by the Nile or by stone, but by stars. An Egypt where the gods lived in the sky, and the sky lived in a goddess. The enigmatic Book of Nut. Gaze upward into the midnight sky over Egypt, and you'll see the heavens roll out like an ancient scroll constellation strung along the curve of the firmament. The Milky Way, stretching from horizon to horizon like a silver river. But to the ancient Egyptians, this was no mere aesthetic wonder. It was the body of a goddess. Her name was Nut. She arched her celestial form across the sky, fingertips and toes touching the earth, her star-studded skin enveloping the world, and within her body, time itself was born. The Book of Nut, also known as the Cosmology of Nut, is one of the most profound and least understood texts to survive from ancient Egypt. It is not a single continuous work, but a collection of astronomical, cosmological, and theological texts found in the tombs of kings and queens, and carved into the ceilings of sarcophagi and temples. It is, in every sense, a celestial manual, part star chart, part religious scripture, part metaphysical thought experiment. And it remains one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Let's begin with the basics. The Book of Nut describes the daily journey of the sun god Re, who is swallowed by Nut at sunset, travels through her body during the night, and is reborn at dawn. This cosmic cycle is not metaphorical, it's architectural. Temples and tombs were aligned to this narrative, built to mirror the divine geography described in the text. But the book does more than mythologize the sun. It maps the stars. It catalogs small constellations used to measure time throughout the night, 36 of them, each appearing in turn as the sky rotates. These decans form the basis of the Egyptian sidereal calendar, a complex system that tracked the movement of stars in 10-day increments, adjusting for seasonal changes, agricultural rhythms, and ritual calendars. And here's where it gets strange. The Book of Nut describes not only the visible stars, but celestial entities that don't appear in the observable night sky. It speaks of hidden stars, of realms within the heavens, of gates and portals through which deities travel. It divides the sky into regions, each governed by different divine laws. Some passages even suggest that the sky itself is layered in early conception of the cosmos that predates Ptolemaic astronomy by over a millennium. It's not just a sky chart, it's a metaphysical diagram. And yet, despite the richness of this text, we barely understand it. Most of our surviving versions are fragmentary. The best known are from the tombs of Ramses VI and Ramses IV in the Valley of the Kings, and from sarcophagi in Saqqara. The text is accompanied by images of Nut, arching across the heavens, stars embedded in her body, while beneath her, other gods manage the machinery of time, Shu, lifting her skyward, Geb, anchoring the earth, Thoth, calculating the passage of celestial bodies. It's a cosmology in motion, but the more we read, the more the mystery deepens. Some scholars believe the Book of Nut was used for precise astronomical calculations predicting the heliacal rising of Sirius, Sopdet, which marked the start of the Nile flood and the Egyptian New Year. Others think it was a manual for rituals, used by priests to align temple ceremonies with the stars. Still others propose it was a guide for the data, celestial map for navigating the afterlife. And perhaps it was all of these things, because in Egypt, religion was never separate from science. Astronomy was theology. Myth was calendar. The gods didn't symbolize forces, they were the forces. And Nut? She wasn't just the night sky, she was time itself. Every star that moved across her belly was a marker in a vast, divine chronometer. Every disappearance and reappearance was a death and resurrection. The night sky was not a void, it was a womb. But there's another layer to this mystery. Some passages of the Book of Nut suggest a knowledge of precession, the slow, cyclical wobble of Earth's axis that changes the position of stars over thousands of years. Modern astronomy only confirmed precession in the 2nd century BCE, thanks to Hipparchus. But if the Egyptians had even a rudimentary understanding of it over 1,000 years earlier, it would rewrite our understanding of their scientific sophistication. There's also the issue of transmission. The Book of Nut does not appear in papyrus scrolls or temple walls in the same way as the Book of the Dead or the Amduat. It's more elusive, more restricted. It shows up in tombs of elite individuals, astronomer priests, royal tomb architects, high officials suggesting it was part of an inner circle of sacred knowledge. And this, in turn, raises a chilling question. How much else have we lost? If this is what survives fragmented, misunderstood, half-translated, what did the full cosmological canon of Egypt look like? What libraries burned? What scrolls turned to ash in Alexandria or rotted in Theban tombs? The Book of Nut hints at a civilization that did not merely observe the starset, embedded them into its identity, that built entire cities to mirror constellations, that timed burials to stellar events, that designed temples not just to face the sun, but to interact with the stars like giant instruments of light. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional. It was design on a cosmic scale. And yet, Nut remains a mystery. We can trace her shape, we can read her names, we can replicate her decans with planetarium software, but we can't feel what the ancient Egyptians felt when they looked up at her. We can't unsee our modern sky. To them, Nut wasn't space. She was mother, protector, devourer, rebirther. Every night, she consumed the sun. Every morning, she gave him back. Her ceiling wasn't just above them. It was within them. And that's the final gift of the Book of Nut. It reminds us that the Egyptians didn't just look up. They lived in the sky. And that sky lived in them. But while Nut's stars were eternal, Egypt's obsessions weren't limited to the heavens. They were buried in the dirt, wrapped in linen, stacked in catacombs. Millions of them. Not people, animals, mummified, and worshipped. The animal necropolises. In Saqqara, Tuna el Gebel, and Abydos, in catacombs that stretch like veins beneath the sand, millions of creatures lie embalmed, not in symbolic relief, not as metaphors, but as literal, mummified animals. Cats, ibises, baboons, crocodiles, bulls, falcons, dogs, ramsevens, scarab beetles, each one wrapped, each one buried, each one a mystery. The animal necropolises of ancient Egypt are staggering in scale. We're not talking about the occasional sacred pet or token burial. We're talking about vast industrial complexes of embalming and internment. Labyrinthine tunnels lined with shelves, chamber after chamber, packed wall to wall with linen-wrapped bodies. In some cases, the numbers reach into the tens of millions. It is death on a mass scale, but not a slaughter, a sacrifice. Because in ancient Egypt, animals were not just companions or livestock. They were avatars, living vessels of the divine. The gods didn't merely resemble animals, they inhabited them. Bastet was the cat, Thoth the ibis, Sobek the crocodile, Anubis the jackal, Hathor the cow. These creatures weren't symbols. They were sacred embodiments. And offering them to the gods was offering the gods themselves. But here's the twist. The practice didn't peak during the Old or Middle Kingdoms, when Egyptian state power was at its height. It exploded during the late period, circa 664–332 BCE, when Egypt was fragmenting politically and increasingly under foreign influence. In a time of uncertainty, ritual went into overdrive. Temples became factories of piety. Priesthoods, seeking to maintain influence, offered access to salvation through sacrifice. For a small fee, pilgrims could purchase an animal, have it ritually killed, embalmed and buried as an offering to their preferred deity. It was devotional commerce, spiritual outsourcing, a theology of transaction, and it worked. The animal cults became powerful economic engines. The Temple of Bastet at Bubastis received thousands of pilgrims a year. The catacombs at Saqqara, associated with the sacred bull Apis and the god Ptah, grew into one of the most densely packed cemeteries in history. The Serapeum alone, built to house the mummies of the Apis bulls, contains massive stone sarcophagi, each weighing up to 70 tons, carved with obsessive precision. These weren't ceremonial husks. They were industrial-grade vaults, sealing divine bodies in black granite sanctity. But not all mummified animals received such luxury. Most were small, disposable, mass-produced. Recent studies, including high-resolution CT scans and isotope analysis, have revealed a startling truth. Many of these animal mummies are empty. Some contain only bones, others just feathers. Some are bundles of linen and mud, shaped to look like animals, but with no actual remains inside. Why? Was it fraud? Were temple priests scamming pious pilgrims? Perhaps, but more likely, it was demand. There were simply too many requests, too many pilgrims, too many offerings. So the temples adapted. They created symbolic substitute eschated fakes, and the people accepted them. Because in the Egyptian mind, ritual was about precision, not content. If the prayer was said, the wrapping correct, the tomb sealed, then the offering was valid. Even a mud scarab could carry a soul to the gods. But not all animal mummies were offerings. Some were oracles. At Tuna el Gebel, in the catacombs of the Ibis, inscriptions reveal that certain birds were used in divination rituals. They were asked questions, watched for signs. Their deaths interpreted like sacred tea leaves. A twitch, a cry, a direction of collapsal could be omens. Others were pets. Some mummies show signs of core injuries healed, bones reset, teeth maintained. One dog was buried with amulets around its neck and its paws carefully crossed as if sleeping. A baboon, buried near the tomb of a high official, had its own coffin, inscribed with prayers. And then there are the crocodiles. Massive ones. Whole family units, mummified together. Some entombed with fish in their stomachs, suggesting they were fed ritual last meals. In Qom, Ombo, and Aswan, crocodile cemeteries extend for kilometers, sometimes accompanied by miniature versions made from clay, placed like talismans beside their larger counterparts. This wasn't just reverence. It was liturgy. Each species had its own rites, its own prayers, its own method of wrapping. Cats had tightly curled bodies with stylized faces. Ibises were bound into cones. Falcons were posed in flight. The embalming recipes, too, varied. Cats were desiccated with natron, then dipped in resin and scented with cedar. Bulls were gutted, packed with spices, and encased in gold. Baboons received brain removal in honor typically reserved for human mummies. It was a mortuary science, a zoo of the sacred. And yet, the reasons remain murky. Why did the animal cults explode so dramatically during the late period? Was it desperation? The psychological response of a crumbling society? A way to manufacture proximity to the divine in the absence of political control? Or was it a last-ditch effort to buy cosmic insurance? Because by the time the Greeks arrived, the system was creaking. The temples were rich, the priesthoods bloated, the rituals automated. Animal mummification had become not a personal act of piety, but a state-run industry. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The Ptolemies adopted some practices, but under Roman rule, the cults were dismantled. The mummification industries collapsed. The catacombs were sealed. Forgotten, buried beneath the dust of empire. Until the 19th century, when looters and early archaeologists broke in only to find a darkness filled not with gold, but with bones. Millions of them, twisted, wrapped, stacked like logs in endless rows. The stench was overwhelming, the silence louder still, and the mystery still unresolved. What drove a civilization to mummify the animal world? To embalm nature itself? To offer it again and again in endless repetitions? We may never know, but the tunnels remain. The shelves remain. The eyes of the cats, the wings of the hawks, the teeth of the jackals wrapped in linen and waiting. And sometimes, what waits is not divine, because among these animals are bodies that once walked upright. Human mummies. Without names, without faces, without any idea who they were. Only the linen, only the tomb, and the mystery of identity lost to time. The unidentified mummies. They lie in silence, their faces long gone, their identities erased by time. Some are curled in fetal positions, others bound with ceremonial rigidity, arms crossed in eternal posture. Their linen wrappings cling like memories, and beneath them bones, brittle and dry, whispering no names. These are the unidentified mummies of ancient Egypt. Not kings, not queens, not those who commanded armies or carved their names into temple walls. These are the forgotten. Some were discovered in sealed coffins with inscriptions so weathered they can no longer be read. Others were found entirely without sarcophagi laid directly into tombs, wrapped in textile layers that crumble at a glance. Some rest in mass burials, others in tombs whose decoration hints at status, but not enough to confirm a name. In a civilization obsessed with remembrance, the ultimate tragedy was to be forgotten. And yet, thousands of these mummies exist. We can see their bones. We can scan their skulls. We can peer into their preserved organs with CT scanners and DNA sequencers, but we cannot say who they were. Why? Because in ancient Egypt, identity after death was not just a luxury, it was a technology. Names were not labels, they were talismans. The Ren, one of the essential parts of the soul, was your name, your spoken identity. As long as it was said, you lived. But if it was erased, if no one could speak it, you were truly dead. This is what makes these mummies so haunting. They were embalmed with care, wrapped with precision, buried with offerings. But their names were lost, literally torn from history, by time, tomb robbers, political upheaval, or simple erosion. Consider the cache of mummies discovered in Deir el-Bahari known as DB 320. It was a hidden tomb, used as a royal reburial chamber during the 21st dynasty. Here, high priests of Amun moved dozens of royal bodies. Thutmose III, Ramesses II, Seti, hiding them from looters. Among them were unidentified individuals. Some were likely servants, guards, or priests. Others could have been royals whose names had been erased, damned by successors, their monuments destroyed, their mummies tucked away as insurance. One theory even suggests that usurped tombs were quietly repurposed, bodies removed, new ones inserted. The grave goods remained, but the name no longer matched the face. And so we're left with bodies in mismatched coffins. DNA tells part of the story. Modern analysis has begun to reconstruct family trees linking certain individuals to known pharaohs. One mummy, long labeled Unknown Woman A, was recently linked by mitochondrial DNA to the family of Amenhotep III, suggesting she may have been one of his daughters or concubines. But for every breakthrough, there are 100 enigmas. Mummies without coffins, coffins without mummies, skulls with no inscriptions, fingerprints with no scroll. Even forensic reconstructions, 3D renderings of facial structures based on preserved skulls offer only haunting silhouettes, faces without names, eyes without stories. And it's not just the elite. In the cemeteries of workers, like those found in Deir el-Medina or Amarna, mummies were buried en masse. Some were buried with simple amulets, others with tokens of their profession: scribal palettes, weaving tools, carpenter's knives. These objects hint at identity, but not name. What makes the absence of identification so piercing is the contrast. Because Egypt went to extraordinary lengths to ensure remembrance. Tomb texts, funerary statues, canopic jarsal labeled. Even commoners etched their names into shopties, into bowls, into wall graffiti. A name meant permanence. It meant protection. It meant immortality. And yet here they are. Hundreds, thousands nameless, numberless. Some wrapped in layers of cloth inscribed with funerary spells, yet unsigned. Some buried with food offerings and faience beads, their markers long eroded. Some disarticulated, their remains scattered by flood, by robbers, by careless excavation. We try to reverse the process. CT scans can reveal age at death, signs of disease, cause of death in some cases. X-rays reveal jewelry embedded in wrappings, artificial eyes, inserted beetles. Isotope analysis tells us where they grew up: Nile Delta, Upper Egypt, Desert Edge. We reconstruct lifestyles, but not names. And then there are the mummies found in tombs that were never completed. Bodies sealed in shafts that were hastily dug and quickly abandoned. Some bear signs of violent death arrowheads embedded, crushed skulls, snapped limbs. Were they victims? Prisoners? Or nobles caught in regime change? There's no cartouche, no wall art, no tomb guardian to guide us. Only silence. Ironically, some of the most physically intact mummies are the most mysterious. In museums across the world, Cairo, London, Paris, Berlin, exquisitely preserved mummies rest in climate-controlled glass cases. Perfectly embalmed, beautifully posed, without a name. They were removed during the frenzy of 19th century antiquarianism, when looters and collectors pried open tombs with no regard for context. The inscriptions were lost, the bones remained, and we're left with puzzle pieces, stripped of reference. We know they were important. That much is clear from the quality of mummification, the golden tongue amulets, the resin-soaked linen, the painted masks. But were they governors? Priests? Wives of the divine? We don't know. And so, in the most ironic twist, they become symbols of what Egypt feared most: oblivion. Because in the Egyptian worldview, the worst fate was not death, it was erasure. To die was expected. To be forgotten was horror. These unnamed mummies are not failures of preservation. They are failures of memory. But they also offer something else: a chance. Every unidentified body is a question still alive. Every tomb without a name is an invitation to imagine, to investigate, to restore. Because even in silence, they endure. And sometimes, silence is just a name waiting to be remembered. But in the quiet of the tomb, there are other dangers. Some said curses, others coincidence. Yet enough explorers, tomb openers, and archaeologists met untimely ends to spawn a legend that has outlived its original victims. The curse of the pharaohs. The curse of the pharaohs phenomenon. It began, as all good curses do, in a tomb. Not just any tomb, but the tomb. Valley of the Kings, 1922. The sun bore down on the Theban cliffs as Howard Carter stood before a sealed doorway, untouched for over 3,000 years. Behind it, the resting place of a boy, king whose name had faded into obscurity. A minor pharaoh, an afterthought. Tutenkhamun. The moment Carter peered through the small chiseled hole in the tomb's door and was asked if he could see anything, his answer became legend. Yes, wonderful things. But wonderful things were only the beginning. Soon after, the tomb was opened, and its contents cataloged jewelry, statues, chariots, thrones, and that iconic golden mask. Another story began to unfurl. A quieter one, a darker one. People started dying. The first was Lord Carnarvon, Carter's patron and financier. He died just a few months after the tomb's discovery, from an infected mosquito bite. At the moment of his death, according to popular reports, the lights in Cairo flickered and went out. Back in England, his dog is said to have let out a howl and collapsed, dead. Coincidence? Maybe. But then others followed. George J. Gould, a wealthy visitor to the tomb, developed a fever and died. Archibald Douglas Reed, who x-rayed the mummy, died shortly afterward. Arthur Mace, a member of Carter's team, dead. Sir Bruce Ingham, who received a mummified hand as a gift, saw his house burn down, twice. In total, by some counts, over 24 individuals connected to the tomb met early or mysterious deaths in the years following its opening. The press ran wild. Headlines screamed of ancient vengeance. Editorial cartoons depicted mummies rising from sarcophagi. Rumors swirled of unspoken warnings inscribed within the tomb. A supposed curse was quoted. Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's peace. No such inscription was ever found. But the myth had already taken root. The curse of the pharaohs. It was the perfect storm of Gothic horror, colonial adventure, and media frenzy. The 1920s were hungry for mystery. Egyptology was booming. And death was always a bestseller. But was there any truth to it? Science, of course, has long dismissed the idea of supernatural revenge from the afterlife. Most of the individuals cited as victims of the curse were elderly, ill, or otherwise predisposed to health issues. Howard Carter himself, the man who broke the seal, lived for another 17 years and died of natural causes. But still, skepticism only added fuel to the fire. Because a real curse doesn't need ghosts. It needs timing. It needs pattern. It needs a hint of fear, wrapped in linen and resin, sealed behind stone. And maybe, just maybe, it needs mold. In recent decades, researchers have proposed a biological basis for the curse. Tombs, especially sealed ones, create the perfect environment for toxic mold, fungi, and bacteria. Aspergillus flavus, for example, can produce mycotoxins capable of causing respiratory failure. Bacteria, like Pseudomonas and Staphylococcus, found on mummy wrappings and in burial chambers, can survive millennia. Add to that decades of dust, bat guano, and humidity, and you have a biological time bomb. Modern archaeologists wear protective gear in these environments. In the 1920s, not so much. Wool suits, handkerchiefs, and mustaches were the standard PPE. So, was the curse microbial? Did explorers, breathing in ancient spores, suffer slow, undiagnosed deaths? Possibly. But the persistence of the curse myth lies deeper. It's psychological, symbolic. Egypt in the ancient worldview was a place of order mat. Disturbing a tomb, unwrapping a body, stealing from the dead, these were cosmic violations. And in a weird way, the modern mind agrees. Even today, with all our rationality, something about cracking open a sarcophagus feels off, wrong, sacred. So the curse endures, not as proof of ancient magic, but as proof of ancient awe. It taps into something primal, fear of death, the weight of memory, the idea that the past does not appreciate being disturbed, that the veil between worlds is thinner than we think. Even in modern excavations, where science reigns, Archaeologists talk of respecting the tomb, of silence, of stillness. The line between researcher and raider remains razor thin. The curse of the pharaohs, then, is not a hex. It's a mirror, a reflection of our guilt, our fascination, our transgression. Because what we call a curse might just be the ghost of reverence, haunting us from the depths of history. And while the curse of Tutenkhamun garners the headlines, it's not unique. Other tombs odder, grander, deeper have their own whispers, and many of them contain objects more perplexing than gold, like obelisks. Gigantic, perfect, balanced like pins on a map of stone. Each one carved from a single slab, each one raised without cranes or pulleys, each one impossible. The construction techniques for obelisks. Imagine a single piece of granite, the size of a 4-story building, over 100 feet long, weighing over 400 tons. Now imagine carving that monolith directly out of bedrock with copper tools, transporting it hundreds of kilometers without wheels or engines, standing it upright with no cranes, no pulleys, no steel reinforcements. This was not hypothetical for the ancient Egyptians. It was Tuesday. Obelisks were the skyscrapers of the ancient world, monuments to permanence, cosmic beacons meant to channel divine energy. They were not just decorative. They were precision-engineered instruments of religious geometry, each one aligned to the cardinal points, etched with solar hymns, crowned with golden pyramidions to catch the first rays of dawn. And yet, despite their ubiquity in temples across Egypt, and their migration across the ancient world, many now stand in Rome, Istanbul, London, and New York. We still don't fully understand how they were made. Start with the quarry. The primary source of obelisk granite was Aswan, in southern Egypt. Here, deep in the granite hills, lies the most famous mystery of all, the unfinished obelisk. Still embedded in the quarry floor, this colossal monument was never completed. It cracked during carving, and the workers abandoned it. But its abandonment is our treasurette reveals the scars of process. Chisel marks, tool striations, strategic undercutting. It measures about 137 feet in length and weighs over 1,100 tons. If it had been completed and erected, it would have been the largest obelisk ever constructed. So how did they start? Using Dollarite hammerstones, rounded, hard volcanic rocks, workers pounded grooves into the granite, carving narrow trenches around the monolith. They didn't use chisels in the traditional sense. Copper tools would have been ineffective against granite. Instead, they created drill lines using abrasion and patient percussion, then chiseled from above and alongside. To detach the obelisk from the bedrock, they likely cut underneath by digging narrow tunnels and inserting wedges or heated materials to cause fracturing. But this technique, while partially visible, remains speculative. No ancient instruction manual survives. No detailed depictions exist. The how remains inferred. And then comes the question of transport. Moving a multi-hundred-ton stone from Aswan to a temple hundreds of miles north was not as simple as dragging it across the desert. Egypt had a secret weapon, the Nile. Flood season was their window. The prevailing theory suggests that obelisks were moved by specially constructed barges. Enormous, flat-bottomed ships, capable of bearing the weight, would be built around the obelisk itself. Workers likely transported the stone to the riverbank, using sledges on lubricated tracks, employing water, clay, or oil to reduce friction. One relief even depicts workers pouring water onto sand in front of a moving sledge, an ancient demonstration of friction management. But the river was only part of the journey. Once the obelisk reached its destination, the real nightmare began, raising it. Erecting an obelisk is a feat of balance, weight distribution, and perfect timing. One misstep, one shift in the base alignment, and the entire monument would snap in two under its own weight. No modern cranes, no hydraulics, just physics. Several competing theories attempt to explain how it was done. The ramp theory. A sloped embankment of sand and brick was constructed at the erection site. The obelisk was dragged up the ramp to a horizontal platform over its foundation trench. Sand was then removed slowly from the trench, allowing the base of the obelisk to descend as the top rose, pivoting into a vertical position. Counterweights and precise coordination would manage the tilt. The pit and lever theory. A deep trench was dug. The base of the obelisk was inserted into the pit. Ropes and levers, combined with pulleys or winches attached to scaffolding, slowly lifted the shaft into place while workers filled the trench to stabilize it. The sandbag method. Sandbags stacked around the obelisk created an artificial hill. As sand was removed from one side, the obelisk slowly tipped upright, gravity doing the work. Once vertical, the remaining sand was removed, leaving it standing. Each method is plausible. Each has flaws, and none have been conclusively proven. The logistics of lifting hundreds of tons of granite with pre-industrial technology remain one of the most elegant, unsolved problems in ancient engineering, especially considering that some temples, like Karnak and Luxor, hosted multiple obelisks often placed symmetrically, precisely oriented to the solstices and equinoxes. The level of astronomical awareness required is staggering. These weren't random erections. They were cosmic signposts. They marked solar events, acted as sundials, and framed ritual processions. The pyramidion capstone was often covered in electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, to reflect the sunlight. An obelisk wasn't just a monument. It was a ray of light. Frozen. Standing. Forever. And here's the kicker. The inscriptions. Carving hieroglyphs into granite was an entirely separate challenge. Without steel tools, scribes and artisans used hard stone points, sand abrasives, and elbow grease to etch divine texts. Some obelisks took years to complete. Every cartouche, every hymn, was a labor of devotion. And yet, despite all this effort, many obelisks were moved, sometimes stolen by later civilizations. Rome looted dozens during its imperial expansions. Caligula brought the Vatican obelisk from Heliopolis. Constantine sent others to Constantinople. Napoleon wanted one for Paris. Modern engineers have used cranes and hydraulic lifts to install these ancient spires in public squares, often taking months of planning and millions of dollars in resources just to reposition what the Egyptians erected with manpower, rope, and faith. And here's what keeps the mystery alive. We still don't know the full process. Not entirely. No papyri. No blueprints. No technical manuals. Just the stones themselves. And their silence. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan waits, half-birthed from the earth, a reminder of ambition halted. Others stand tall at Karnak, at Luxor, at the Place de la Concorde, casting shadows that have outlived empires. And as we stare upward, we realize the technology may be gone, but the awe remains. And just beyond these impossible towers lie the tombs, not the ones with doors, the ones painted on the walls. False doors that don't open, but might have once. The purpose of false doors in tombs. Step into an Egyptian tomb, and you'll likely find a wall carved with an ornate frame, complete with lintel, jambs, and a threshold just like a door. But this door does not open. It leads to no room. It is solid stone, carved in relief. Sometimes it is painted, other times sculpted with great depth, crowned with offerings, flanked by columns of hieroglyphs. It is a door in name only. Or is it? These are the false doors of ancient Egypt, and they are everywhere. Tombs from the Old Kingdom to the New, from Giza to Thebes, from Mastabas to Pyramid Sol contain them. They are as common as coffins, as symbolic as pyramids, and yet their full meaning remains elusive. At first glance, They seem like artistic flourishes, metaphorical passageways between the world of the living and the dead, and that's partly true. But their consistency, their precision, and their centrality suggest something deeper, more ritualistic, more mechanical. These were not decorative. They were functional, but in a way that only the ancient Egyptians could conceive. Let's begin with their placement. The false door was almost always located on the west wall of the tomb, Chapeltha wall facing the setting sun. To the Egyptians, the west was the land of the dead, the place where the sun died each day before being reborn in the morning. The tomb's entire architecture was a metaphor for death and rebirth. The false door was the interface. It was through this door that the deceased's Khath life force was believed to pass, moving between the afterlife and the world of the living. During funerary rites, priests would present offerings to this door: bread, beer, meat, incense, linen. They would speak the names of the dead, recite prayers, pour libations. These were not symbolic acts, they were transactions. The false door was the delivery slot. The offerings were fuel for the soul. And like any portal, it had rules. The inscriptions on false doors were specific. They listed the name and titles of the deceased. They included offering formula-standardized texts requesting hundreds of items from various gods, especially Anubis and Osiris. They included instructions to passers-by: say the following offering prayer. In other words, the door wasn't just for priests, it was for everyone. Any literate visitor to the tomb could activate the ritual simply by speaking the formula aloud. A linguistic switch, a phonetic key. Speak the name, say the words, and the Ka eats. That's how the Egyptians saw it. But here's where it gets even stranger. Some false doors contain what appear to be marks, indentations, discolorations, even traces of oil. In some cases, the base of the door shows signs of repeated use, footprints in the dust, the stone smoothed by contact. This wasn't abstract. People used these doors, touched them, prayed at them. They were treated like actual thresholds. Some scholars have proposed that certain rituals involved temporarily opening a spiritual passageway through the door, in essence, a rite of summoning. The Ka would come forth, absorb the offerings, and retreat. Others suggest that false doors acted as focus points for the deceased's consciousness, a kind of architectural avatar. The soul wasn't inside the sarcophagus, it was at the door, watching, waiting. In elite tombs, the false door was often carved in exquisite detail, sometimes with a statue niche above it, or a serdab, a sealed chamber with a peephole. Behind it, containing a statue of the deceased looking through. This setup created a feedback loop of visibility. The living saw the door, the dead saw the living. It was a two-way mirror, a place of eternal interface. But not all false doors are in tombs. Some appear in temples. Some are carved into boundary stones or cenotaphs, monuments that mark symbolic resting places, even if the body lies elsewhere. Some are entirely anonymous, no name, no offering formula, just the shape. What were these for? Were they emergency exits for displaced souls? Cosmic routers for wandering Kas? Or something else entirely? A few experimental archaeologists have proposed an even wilder theory, that false doors may have functioned acoustically resonating under certain chants or frequencies, perhaps even amplifying voices during rites. Sound magic. Architecture as instrument. While no definitive proof exists, the Egyptian belief in vibration and recitation as spiritual tools is well documented. The voice was power, to name was to create, and the door was where names came home. Of course, false doors weren't just for individuals. Whole families had them. Some tombs contain rows of false doors, each one for a different ancestor, servant, or scribe. A spiritual hallway, a network of portals, the original Facebook. In some rare cases, tombs have duplicate false doors sewn in the chapel, one in the burial chamber. Were they backup ports? Redundant systems? Did the Ka switch lanes if one got blocked? We don't know. But the consistency is staggering. Across centuries, dynasties, and regions, the form barely changes. Rectangular frame, inset panel, hieroglyphs above and beside, offering table in front. A simulation of entry, and yet, in function, a paradox. It's a door that doesn't open unless you believe. It speaks to the Egyptian obsession with duality. Life and death, seen and unseen, matter and spirit. The false door was both a symbol and a tool, a fiction that functioned, a boundary that connected. And it worked. Because even now, thousands of years later, we stand before them and feel the impulse to reach out, to knock, to wonder, is someone home? And as we leave the tomb, back into the desert heat, we are reminded that some doors are not meant to be opened but only understood. And just beyond that threshold, another mystery waits. Not in a temple, not in a tomb, but in the empty outlines of places once filled with life. Settlements, whole towns, vanished. The unexplained abandonment of settlements. Across the sun-scorched deserts and along the fertile banks of the Nile, Egypt's ancient cities once thrummed with life. Settlements rose like embers from the earth built of mud brick and prayer, populated by priests and potters, scribes and soldiers, children and cats. These were not the temples of gods or the tombs of kings. These were the places where Egypt breathed, where beer was brewed, where papyrus was inked, where sandals slapped packed earth streets. And then, in more than a few places, the sandals stopped. Silence settled. Doors were left open, cooking pots still in hearths, and the city some of them vanished. Not buried under sand, not destroyed by war, just abandoned, suddenly, without explanation. And that's what makes this mystery so unnerving, because we're not talking about places we never found. We're talking about settlements that were found, excavated, studied places we know existed, whose streets we have walked in archaeological memory and yet whose end remains an unsolved equation. Take, for example, the workers' village of Deir el-Medina. Nestled on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor, this walled community housed the artisans and laborers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It was a model town, grid-planned, socially stratified, with temples, houses, latrines, and a legal system. We know more about daily life here than almost anywhere else in Egypt. Love poems, laundry lists, trial records all preserved on ostraca and tucked into the dry soil. And yet, around the end of the 20th dynasty, sometime in the 11th century BCE, the village was abruptly abandoned. Why? No conquest, no fire layer, no plague pit. Some speculate that state funding dried up as the new kingdom waned, and the workers simply left. Others suggest the political instability following the death of Ramses XI caused the priesthood of Amun to absorb administrative control, shifting population centers. But the truth? We don't know. The last entry in the Deir el-Medina journals simply stops. The people disappeared. The houses were left behind, and the sand crept in. Now multiply that silence across dozens of sites. In the Fayoum Oasis Onse, a lush green cradle of Greco-Roman settlement archaeologists have uncovered entire farming villages, complete with irrigation channels and storehouses, suddenly emptied in the 2nd century CE. The infrastructure remains, meticulously engineered, but the people? Gone. In Amarna, the city built by the heretic king Akhenaten, abandonment was almost inevitable. His monotheistic revolution collapsed after his death, and the city was purposefully deserted. But even knowing that, the scale of withdrawal still stuns. Entire palace complexes, administrative centers, elite villas left to rot. And then there are sites without convenient ideological reasons. Settlements from the Middle Kingdom, thriving under rulers like Senusret and Amenemhat, show signs of sudden disuse. Fortresses innubiable to project Egyptian power deep into Africa are abandoned during times of relative peace, not war. Large towns in the Delta disappeared without evidence of flooding or famine. Even in the heartland of Upper Egypt, major urban centers show signs of depopulation, interrupted construction, and vacant compounds. So what happened? Was it environmental? The Nile is both lifeblood and executioner. Its floods sustained agriculture but were also deeply unpredictable. When flood levels dropped consistently for several years, the land dried, crops failed, and people moved. Paleoclimatic studies suggest multiple periods of intense drought throughout Egyptian history, most notably around 2200 BCE, contributing to the collapse of the Old Kingdom, and again during the Late Bronze Age. But drought doesn't empty a city overnight. It's a slow bleed. The settlements in question seem to have been evacuated with unsettling speed like modern ghost towns after a chemical spill. Some houses show signs of being left mid-use, pottery half-glazed, ovens still full of ash, tools lying where they were dropped. This points to something else. Plague? Possibly. The written record is relatively silent on disease, but Egypt was certainly no stranger to epidemics. Bodies buried hastily in communal pits, especially during the late Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period, suggest sudden death on a wide scale. But again, this doesn't explain all cases. War? Raids? Economic collapse? Political instability? All possible. And yet, even where such events are documented, they don't always correlate with the sites that vanish. Some of the most stable periods still saw towns abandoned. Conversely, settlements in high conflict zones sometimes persisted through centuries of war. What if the answer lies in how Egypt itself thought about place? Unlike modern cities, ancient Egyptian settlements were intimately tied to cultic geography and sacred topography. A village existed not just where it was convenient, but where the gods allowed. When temple rituals changed, when a deity's cult moved, or a festival cycle shifted, it could reconfigure the entire social and urban layout of an area. In this model, abandonment isn't collapse. It's ritual closure. When a sacred function was fulfilled, or when divine favor shifted, the settlement may have been retired in a ceremonial sense. Just like temples were sometimes ritually decommissioned, perhaps entire towns could be as if hitting a cosmic reset. But even that doesn't explain the full eeriness of what's been found. In some sites, archaeologists found attempts at rebuilding walls half rebuilt, new floors laid, grain silos restocked, and then nothing. Like people tried to come back, tried to restart, and then gave up. Like something drove them out again. And here's where the imagination opens a darker door. Because Egypt was not only a land of gods, and order, it was a land of chaos held at bay. The desert, the uninhabited zones, the edge of the known world, these were realms of danger, of demons, of serpents. Every settlement was an act of defiance against entropy. So when a place was abandoned, it wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. Perhaps something was broken. Perhaps the contract between land and people was severed. And in a land where every square foot of arable ground was precious, for people to walk away suggests fear, or fate, or something we can no longer name. And while Egypt's monuments have endured for millennia, its settlements were built of earth and reed, mud and thatch. They disappear easily, too easily. One season of flood, one generation of neglect, and an entire town becomes soil again. And yet, in the soil, they whisper, traces of footprints, post holes, foundation outlines, a child's figurine buried in a corner, a doorway facing the sunset, echoes, ghosts. We dig them up, label them, photograph them, and still the question lingers. Why did they leave? Where did they go? And what were they fleeing? Because sometimes, in the abandonment, we see not just an absence but a warning. One we can't fully translate. One that speaks in absences. But before we can answer, the trail curves in a new direction away from settlements and into sacred geometry. Because while people vanished, the pyramids did not. And those pyramids, as it turns out, may have encoded secrets even in their shape. Secrets about circles. And how to square them. The lack of papyrus records for certain periods. Ancient Egypt was, in many ways, a civilization of ink and paper. Before there were scrolls in Greece, before libraries in Rome, before bound books ever touched the parchment of medieval Europe, there was papyrus, the river-borne gift that turned Egypt into a kingdom of record keepers. They wrote everything. Administrative memos, tax receipts, religious texts, spells, legal contracts, love letters, obituaries, border treaties, grain tallies, hunting guides, and complaints about loud neighbors everything. And then, suddenly, nothing. There are chasms in the record. Whole dynasties seem to evaporate. The voices stop. The scribes fall silent. The scrolls vanish. We call them dark periods not because of violence or bloodshed, but because of paper. Because the records we know should exist simply don't. Let's be clear. Papyrus was the hard drive of Egypt. It was lightweight, portable, and relatively durable in dry climates. The Nile Delta's marshes gave Egypt an almost inexhaustible supply. Whole bureaucracies were built around the assumption that information could be stored and retrieved easily. Temples, granaries, military outposts, and private homes were staffed with scribesmen, and occasionally women, who dedicated their lives to marking time and transaction. And yet, when we try to stitch together a coherent timeline of Egypt's past, we hit voids. Great, yawning voids. The first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, the third, even parts of the late period. We don't know what happened. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the papyrus is gone. So where did it go? Was it destroyed? Eaten? Lost? Or something stranger? Let's start with the basics. Papyrus, despite its resilience in dry climates, is organic. It decomposes, it burns, it can be shredded, recycled, buried, or nibbled to dust by beetles and mice. In Lower Egypt, where the water table is higher, preservation is virtually impossible unless a document is sealed inside a jar, tomb, or desert cave. Most of the papyri we do have were found in Upper Egypt or the western desert places like Elephantine, Thebes, or the monastery-studded cliffs of Nag Hammadi. But these are exceptions, not rules. In the Nile Delta where Egypt's biggest cities once stood, moisture and urban development have obliterated untold libraries. Cities like Memphis, Heliopolis, and Tanis were administrative centers teeming with record-keeping. Today, they're archaeological wastelands for papyrus. So, the first answer is preservation bias. We're simply not digging in the right climate. But that's only part of the story. Because even in the dry zones there are gaps. Scribes didn't stop working. Bureaucracy didn't halt. Yet we lack personal letters, official decrees, temple inventories, and court records from entire centuries. In some eras, we don't even have kings' names in papyrus form, just monumental inscriptions left to weather on stone. It's as if the voice of the people vanished. Some scholars suggest that during times of economic or political instability, the production of papyrus slowed. The state couldn't fund scribal schools. The Nile's flood failed. Resources were diverted to survival, not documentation. During foreign occupations by the Hyksos, Libyans, Assyrians, or Persians, writing systems may have shifted, scribal standards altered, archives lost in the shuffle of empire. Still, Egypt was remarkably good at continuity. Even after collapse, scribes often re-emerged with the same scripts, the same gods, the same bureaucratic habits. Hieratic, Demotic, and eventually Coptic writing styles all show lineage to earlier systems. So the question remains, why can't we find the papyri? Here's a darker possibility: deliberate destruction. Papyrus was recyclable. Old scrolls could be pulped, washed, or scraped for reuse. In temples, outdated liturgical texts were replaced by newer theological interpretations. In administrations, obsolete tax records were discarded or repurposed. In households, worn scrolls might be repurposed for kindling or padding. Even religious scrolls like early versions of the Book of the Dead could be ritually buried, burned, or entombed with the dead. Now imagine a crisis. A dynasty falls. A new god is in fashion. The names of former rulers become taboo. Suddenly, thousands of documents are illegal, heretical, dangerous. What do? You burn them. You hide them. You erase the ink. You bury the rest. We see this behavior repeatedly in Egypt's history. Akhenaten's religious revolution tried to wipe out the entire pantheon, replacing it with Aten. When he died, his successors waged a campaign of damnatio memoria, chiseling out his name, smashing his statues, and likely destroying his papyri. Later, pharaohs and high priests would do the same to rivals, heretics, and forgotten royals. History was curated. The past was edited. And papyrus was the easiest target. But there's another theory. One that's less sinister and more existential. Perhaps the scrolls weren't lost. Perhaps they were never written. Or at least, not in the form we expect. Imagine a century of silent synod because the scribes forgot how to write, but because what mattered couldn't be written. During the periods we now call intermediate, Egypt was fractured. Local warlords ruled in pockets. Cities feuded. Resources dwindled. Under these conditions, the priorities of writing may have shifted from public records to private rituals. A priest didn't record the king's taxes. He recorded a spell. A widow didn't write a property deed. She wrote a lament. A village didn't keep court documents. They scratched a curse into a pot and buried it in the field. This shift from state to individual, from formal to informal, from public record to private magic, may explain part of the gap. Much of what we do find from these periods isn't bureaucratic at all. It's religious, poetic, or apotropaic. Ostraca, graffiti, amulets, tiny documents of survival. A civilization speaking not in scrolls, but in shards. And when stability returned, when centralized power reasserted itself, the scribes came back to their old habits. Archives grew, temples redocumented, the record resumed. But the lost century stayed lost. And here's what makes it all worse. Egyptian papyrus didn't only vanish in antiquity, it vanished in modernity. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, a papyrus was worth more than gold in the antiquities market. Dealers broke up scrolls into pieces to sell them individually. Entire libraries were smuggled, scattered, and sold. Some were burned by accident. Some by ignorance. Some by missionaries who saw pagan texts as demonic. Even today, countless papyri sit in private collections, untranslated, unpublished, and slowly decaying. We have only scratched the surface of what was written, and already so much is lost. But that's the nature of Egypt. Stone remembers. Paper does not. Stone is loud. Paper whispers. Stone lasts. Paper vanishes. And in that vanishing, we glimpse the fragility of memory itself. Because for all its power, Papyrus was mortal, like the scribes who wielded it. And now, in the archives of eternity, there are blank pages. Pages we'll never read. But there's one monument that doesn't stay silent. It stares, with eyes carved in limestone, half buried in the sand, eternally enigmatic. The Sphinx. And its age may be far older than we think. The Sphinx's age. There it, crouched shaft-lion, half-human, fully enigmatic. The great Sphinx of Giza, guardian of the plateau, eternal sentinel of secrets. With the body of a recumbent beast and the face of a king, or perhaps someone older or something else entirely, it has watched over the desert sands for thousands of years. Or has it? That question, the question of its age, might be one of the most profound and persistently controversial in all of Egyptology. Because, according to mainstream chronology, the Sphinx was built around 2500 BCE, commissioned by Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. Its face is said to be modeled after his own. Its alignment with his pyramid complex seems convenient, even logical. There's a temple in front of it, an unfinished causeway, an architectural narrative that fits nicely within the context of the Old Kingdom. Case closed, right? Not quite. Because the Sphinx isn't just a statue, it's an anomaly. A geological riddle. A weathered mystery that refuses to conform. And when you really start looking at the evidence, when you examine the erosion, the scale, the context, you begin to wonder, is the Sphinx older than Egypt itself? Let's start with the basics. The Sphinx is carved directly from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau. It wasn't assembled from blocks like the pyramid sit was excavated. Sculpted from a natural protuberance, its body is nearly 240 feet long, and its head rises about 66 feet above the ground. Adjacent to the Sphinx is the so-called Sphinx Temple, also hewn from bedrock and constructed with some of the largest stone blocks in Egyptium, weighing more than 200 tons. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Geologists, particularly those not bound by traditional Egyptological timeline shave, pointed out something strange about the Sphinx's body. It's heavily eroded. But not just eroded by wind and sand, as you'd expect in a desert. The pattern of erosion on the Sphinx's enclosure walls those sheer cliffs that surround Abydos, vertical and undulating, more consistent with rainfall-induced weathering. Rounded edges, deep fissures, water wear. And that's a problem, because it hasn't rained like that in Egypt for a very, very long time. Climatological data suggests that the last period of sustained heavy rainfall in the Giza region ended sometime around 5000 to 7000 BCE. That's long before Khafre ever breathed. Long before the pyramids. Long before dynastic Egypt. So if the Sphinx enclosure was shaped by rain, it had to be exposed to the elements during the pre-dynastic period, which means the Sphinx itself, at least in some form, might be thousands of years older than we thought. Cue the debates. Mainstream Egyptologists argue that the erosion could be caused by other factors, perhaps pooling water from flash floods or capillary action from groundwater. They emphasize the stylistic link between the Sphinx's face and known statues of Khafre and the proximity to his pyramid complex. They also point to the lack of inscriptions. If it were built in some earlier era, why no references in pre-dynastic records? But geologists like Robert Schoch and others counter that no amount of flash flooding explains the smooth, rounded weathering patterns. They argue that the body's deep weathering is inconsistent with what's seen on other Old Kingdom monuments nearby, which exhibit only shallow wind erosion. And then there's the matter of the head. The Sphinx's head is disproportionately small compared to its body. Oddly small. Some researchers suggest it was recarved possibly from an earlier lion or animal figure into the image of a human. If so, the original Sphinx might have been far older, only modified during Khafre's time or later. This idea isn't as crazy as it sounds. We know the Egyptians reused and reshaped statues constantly. Names were scratched out, faces reworked, meanings shifted. If the Sphinx was an inherited monument already ancient in Khafre's time, then its reworking would fit with Egyptian traditions of cultural inheritance. And it also opens a Pandora's box. Because if the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt, who built it? And why? There are no direct records. No inscriptions on the Sphinx itself. No cartouches. No dedicatory plaques. Even Thutmose IV, centuries later, had to create the dream stele between its paws to tell a story about the Sphinxone that speaks of it already being buried in sand, neglected, a relic of a bygone age. That stele, by the way, does not attribute the Sphinx to Khafre. It simply references a mysterious king and a promise of kingship made in a dream. If the Sphinx was already ancient by the time of Thutmose, then who was Khafre to it? A restorer? A renovator? And then there's the alignment. The Sphinx faces due east. Its gaze meets the rising sun at the spring and autumn equinoxes. This kind of solar alignment was sacred to Egyptians, but it's also astronomically intriguing. Some archaeoastronomers argue that around 10,500 BCE, the constellation Leoth Lion rose directly behind the Sphinx during the vernal equinox. If the Sphinx was originally designed as a lion, which its body shape supports, then this celestial alignment could point to its origin as a sky marker during that era. 10,500 BCE. That's deep time. That's pre-agriculture. That's Göbekli Tepe territory, suggesting the existence of a civilization capable of sculpting the Sphinx then would rewrite history as we know it. And yet, there it sits, not just older than the pyramids, possibly older than writing, older than cities, a monument from a forgotten epoch whose builders left no name, no blueprint, no legacy but stone. So where does that leave us? In the uncomfortable space between certainty and mystery. Mainstream archaeology continues to date the Sphinx to Khafre's reign, citing proximity, artistic style, and lack of alternative evidence. Alternative researchers continue to push for deeper timelines, citing geology, astronomical data, and comparative erosion studies. And the Sphinx itself? It remains silent. Silent, but not passive. It watches. It waits. Every year, more sand is cleared from its flanks. More scans are run. More hypotheses floated. And yet, its true origin eludes us. Maybe it always will. Maybe that's the point. Because the Sphinx isn't just a statue. It's a mirror. A challenge. A question without an answer. What if history is older than we think? What if time is layered and memory incomplete? What if Egypt was not the beginning but the heir? And somewhere beneath the Sphinx's weathered paws, carved deep into the bedrock, lies the key to a prehistorical truth we're still not ready to face? It wouldn't be the first time Egypt held on to secrets. It wouldn't be the last. And while debates about its age continue to rage, another, quieter mystery stretches out in the laboratories and museums across the world inside the genomes of the Egyptians themselves. Because, while monuments may last forever, the people who built them did not. They died. They were mummified. And their bones tell a story. A story of migration, of mixing, of identity. A story that begins with a question just as profound as the Sphinx's riddle. Where did the Egyptians come from? The origins of the Egyptian race. Ancient Egypt, a land of colossal stone, solar kings, and divine floods. A civilization so iconic, so steeped in mystery and splendor, that it has come to symbolize an entire continent, a historical age, and sometime a battleground of identity. Because behind the pyramids and the papyri lies a question that has sparked more controversy, more debate, and more modern projection than perhaps any other in the study of the ancient world. Who were the ancient Egyptians? Where did they come from? And how much do we really know about their racial, ethnic, and genetic origins? On the surface, it seems like an easy enough inquiry. You look at skeletal remains, you study DNA, you examine linguistic roots and cultural ties, and you map out migration patterns. But Egypt is not a surface-level civilization. Its history spans more than 3,000 years longer than the time between Cleopatra and us. It underwent invasions, migrations, dynastic upheavals, religious transformations, and contact with nearly every major culture in the ancient world. Egypt didn't just endure history, it was history. So let's start at the beginning, or as close as we can get. Long before the pharaohs wore crowns, before Narmer unified Upper and Lower Egypt, before scribes learned to carve hieroglyphs into temple walls, there were the people of the Nile. In the earliest phases of prehistory around 10,000 BCE, Nile Valley was a ribbon of fertility winding through an increasingly arid Sahara. People clustered along its banks, fishing, hunting, and gradually learning to farm. These proto-Egyptians were part of a broader North African Sudanese corridor of human settlement groups that were mobile, adaptive, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of river and sky. Some of their ancestors had come up from sub-Saharan Africa. Others, possibly, filtered down from the Levant or moved west from the Red Sea corridor. This wasn't migration in the sense of single dramatic invasions. It was slow diffusion, cultural osmosis, families shifting landscapes over generations, cultures blending, not clashing. By the time Egypt coalesced into a recognizable kingdom around 3100 BCE, it already bore the marks of this layered ancestry. The early dynastic Egyptians worshipped gods that mirrored the animalistic pantheons of both African and Near Eastern traditions. They buried their dead in ways reminiscent of both Saharan and Mesopotamian customs. They built tombs that mixed Nubian motifs with Levantine architecture. Egypt, even in its infancy, was a hybrid. Now, let's talk about the people themselves. Skeletal remains from pre-dynastic and early dynastic cemeteries like those found at Nakata, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis reveal a population with a wide range of physical features. Some skulls resemble those found further south in Nubia and Central Africa. Elongated crania, pronounced prognathism, robust jawlines. Others show traits more commonly associated with the Mediterranean and Levant: broader faces, shorter nasal bones, lighter bone density. In short, Egypt was never one thing. It was a spectrum, and that spectrum only expanded as the centuries rolled on. Egypt's location made it a literal crossroads bordered by the Mediterranean, connected to the Sinai, tethered by the Nile to the heart of Africa. Trade routes, warpaths, and pilgrimage trails ran through its deserts and delta. Goods came in. So did genes. During the Old Kingdom, Egypt had strong connections with Nubia, to the south bringing in gold, incense, soldiers, and likely spouses. Nubians appear in Old Kingdom art not as enemies, but as collaborators and subjects. During the Middle Kingdom, Egypt extended its reach into the Levant, importing Asiatic influences and absorbing Semitic-speaking immigrants. During the New Kingdom, its imperial apexit became an international powerhouse, attracting peoples from Libya, Syria, Palestine, and beyond. The royal harem, the military, and the temple elite became more ethnically diverse, a mosaic of Mediterranean and African lineages. So when people ask, were the ancient Egyptians black or white? The question itself is flawed. Ancient Egypt existed long before our modern racial categories were invented. The concepts of black and white are not biologically fixed, they're social constructs shaped by time and place. Trying to map those constructs onto ancient populations is like trying to measure hieroglyphs with a digital watch. But that hasn't stopped anyone from trying. For centuries, scholars and pseudoscientists have projected their own biases onto the mummies and monuments. In the 19th century, European explorers marveled at Egypt's sophistication and claimed it as a Mediterranean civilization too advanced, in their view, to be African. They redrew the boundaries of civilization to exclude blackness. Meanwhile, Pan-African scholars and Afrocentrists pushed back, arguing that ancient Egypt was fundamentally a black African culture, one rooted in the Nile Valley and kin to the civilizations of Nubia, Kush, and the wider sub-Saharan world. Both sides sought ownership. Neither wanted ambiguity. But Egypt is ambiguity. Its kings were born in the south, crowned in the north, married women from Asia, and fought wars in Africa. Its gods wore African animal heads, spoke in Semitic rhythms, and ruled from cosmic thrones that transcended ethnicity. Even in their own art, the Egyptians depicted themselves in a variety of skin tones ranging from reddish-brown to deep brown to light tan. Men were often shown darker than women, not necessarily because of race, but because men worked outside and women inside. Nubians were often painted with darker skin and distinct hairstyles, but again, that was symbolic, a shorthand for origin, not biology. And then there's DNA. In recent years, genetic studies on Egyptian mummies have added fuel to the fire and confusion to the dialogue. One highly publicized study in 2017 extracted DNA from 90 mummies at Abu Sir el-Melek, dating from the New Kingdom to the Roman period. The results suggested a closer genetic affinity with Near Eastern populations than with sub-Saharan Africans. Media headlines ran wild. Egyptians were more Middle Eastern than African. But critics were quick to point out the study's limitations. First, the sample size was small. Second, it focused on a single site in northern Egypt, far from the cultural heartlands of Upper Egypt and Nubia. Third, it came from a period of intense foreign influence long after the heyday of the pharaonic state. And, most importantly, DNA degrades. Ancient genomes are fragile, and extracting viable sequences from hot, arid climates like Egypt is extremely difficult. So the data we do have is partial, fragmentary, and subject to interpretation. But newer studies, broader in scope, are beginning to show a more complex picture that confirms what archaeology already suggested. That the ancient Egyptian genome was a mixture, a blend of local African ancestry and incoming Eurasian influences, fluctuating over time, shifting with the tides of empire, trade, and conquest. It wasn't static. It wasn't monolithic. It was Egyptian. And perhaps that's the most radical idea of all, that a people can be many things at once. That identity is not a checklist, but a current. Flowing, like the Nile, carving culture from contradiction. So, when we look at the mummy of Ramses III's red hair preserved by embalming Saltzer, the bones of a farmer buried near Aswan, or the face of a priestess painted on a Fayum portrait, we are not seeing answers. We are seeing echoes. Echoes of a civilization that knew itself not by blood, but by ritual. Not by skin, but by symbol. To be Egyptian was to speak the language of the gods, to serve the rhythms of the Nile, to live in the shadow of monuments, and to die into eternity. And that identity was open not to everyone, perhaps, but to many. Libyans became generals. Asiatics became scribes. Nubians became kings. The boundary was cultural. And culture, like the desert wind, never stays still. In the end, the search for the true race of the Egyptians tells us more about ourselves than it does about them. It reveals our need for certainty, our hunger for heritage, our fear of complexity. But Egypt was never afraid of complexity. It embraced duality, order and chaos, Sunday and moon, upper and lower, life and death. And as we move forward in this labyrinth of unknowns, we begin to see the pattern not just in skin or skeleton, but in spirit. a spirit that echoed through vanished cults, whose gods once ruled and then faded, leaving only whispers in stone. And those whispers call us toward the next mystery, not of people, but of gods. Gods that vanished without a trace. The disappearance of specific cults or deities. In the vast pantheon of ancient Egypt, gods were born not from nothing, but from need. They rose with the sun, swam in the Nile, governed every grain of sand and beat of the heart. There were gods for fertility and gods for war, gods for writing, for embalming, for measuring the flood. Some wore crowns of lotus and papyrus, others wore the heads of falcons, jackals, cats, rams, and crocodiles. They lived in temples and statues, in prayers and amulets. They ruled not from afar, but intimately, imminently. Egypt was not monotheistic. It wasn't even polytheistic in the tidy Greco-Roman sense. Egypt was a divine ecosystem. And yet, this ecosystem was never fixed. It changed. It morphed. And sometimes, it pruned its own branches. Some gods endured from the predynastic days through the Ptolemaic twilight: Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis. Others came into fashion late but flared brilliantly like Serapis or Bes. But some gods, once powerful and regionally dominant, simply vanished. Gone. No decline. No reform. No transformation into other deities. Just silence. As if the priests stopped speaking their names, and the names dissolved like ink in the flood. How does that happen? How does a god die? Let's start with an example. The god Shed. Not one of the great Ennead, not a solar titan, but immensely popular during the New Kingdom. Shed was the savior, the rescuer from misfortune, a protector against evil beasts, snakes, demons, and sudden death. He was personal, intimate. His images appear on amulets, stelae, and household shrines. In many ways, Shed was the everyday god, the divine equivalent of a guardian angel or a patron saint. And then, after the third intermediate period, Shed disappears. No more amulets. No more prayers. No mention in temple inscriptions. Gone. Another example. Were the cow. Her name means great of magic. She was a goddess of protection, often seen on royal crowns, defending kings and queens from demonic forces. She was invoked in spells, honored in tombs. Her name carried weight in magical rituals. By the late period, almost completely gone. There are others, dozens of them. Anjedi, a god of the underworld with links to Osiris. Kenti Amentiu, an early form of the dead's guardian. Medjed, a strange figure from the Book of the Dead, whose depiction is so ambiguous he's become an internet meme. Each one of these deities had temples, priests, worshippers, and now, dust. Why? Part of the answer lies in politics. Religion in Egypt wasn't just spiritual, it was governmental. Each nome, province, had its own patron gods, its own temples, its own priesthoods. When dynasties shifted, when power moved from one region to another, so too did divine favor. The god of one capital became a footnote in another. When Thebes rose, Amun rose with it. When Memphis was strong, Ptah held sway. Religion followed the throne. But that's only part of it. There's also the nature of syncretism. Egyptian gods were constantly merging. Ra becomes Amun-Ra, Horus becomes Ra-Horakti, Osiris merges with Sokar and Ptah in complex funerary triads. This wasn't unusual, it was theology by hybridization. Deities weren't jealous. They were mutable, fluid. So perhaps when Shed disappears, he doesn't die. Perhaps he's absorbed his powers, folded into Horus or Bes, or even Isis. Maybe his name was lost, but his essence survived. But in many cases, this absorption doesn't leave a trail. There are no transition myths. No doctrinal declarations. Just a disappearance. Some deities, especially the hyper-local ones, may have never had official recognition. They lived in homes, not temples. They were spoken to in the dark, not inscribed in stone. When the family line ended, or the village was abandoned, so too was the god. Others fell victim to state-sponsored theological reform. Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution is the most famous example abolishing the traditional gods in favor of the Aten, a solar disk deity stripped of personality and mythology. Temples to Amun were closed, his name chiseled out, statues smashed, priests deposed. When the old religion returned, so did many of the gods. But not all. The damage had been done, and this happened again and again. Every time a new power consolidated control, the religious order was reshuffled. During the Sati period, there was a move toward canonical theology streamlining the pantheon, focusing on a smaller set of universal gods. During the Ptolemaic era, Hellenistic influence fused Egyptian gods with Greek ones. Thoth became Hermes, Isis became Aphrodite, Serapis was created from scratch as a cultural bridge. Some gods adapted. Some didn't. Some were too localized, too redundant, or too politically inconvenient to survive. And then came Christianity. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had taken root across Egypt. Pagan temples were closed, icons were defaced, priests were exiled or converted. The old gods were demonized, worse, forgotten. Isis, once the queen of heaven, became a witch in Christian texts. Horus became an echo of Christ. And all those minor gods? Lost beneath the tide. But not entirely. Because something curious happened. Some gods, though stripped of their names and forms, bled into folk traditions, into saints' cults, into magical texts, into Coptic manuscripts and rural rituals. The god Besa, grotesque dwarf protector of mothers and children, survives in Coptic amulets. The goddess Taweret, with her hippopotamus snout and lion claws, lives on in fertility charms. Even after their names were erased, the functions of these gods endured. Because people still needed them. They needed protection, healing, luck. The divine didn't vanish. It shapeshifted. It whispered. And in this way, the disappearance of the gods isn't final. It's transformation. But the silence remains troubling. As we dig through temple ruins and unroll forgotten scrolls, we are haunted by the knowledge that we are only hearing part of the chorus. There were once hundreds of gods whose names we no longer know. Thousands of prayers we will never translate. Entire cults whose rituals were so specific, so personal, that when the last priest died, the entire theology died with him. In this sense, the gods of Egypt were mortal, not in the flesh, but in the word. They lived as long as they were spoken. And now, they are bones beneath stone, occasionally glimpsed, rarely understood, and always waiting. Waiting for the archaeologist's brush, the scholar's hunch, the chance discovery of a name in a cartouche that doesn't belong. The mummification of the Dead Sea Scrolls theory. It starts with a whisper, a peculiar observation, a marginal footnote in a sprawling archaeological report. Something about the scrolls, those most enigmatic relics of the Judean desert, the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls, doesn't quite add up. It's not their language, nor their theology, nor even their strange apocalyptic tone. It's their condition, their texture, their preservation. They look mummified. And that idea that ancient Egyptian mummification techniques were somehow used to preserve these ancient Jewish textures grown into one of the most fringe, fascinating, and frankly bizarre mysteries to ever link two of the ancient world's most iconic civilizations. Let's start with what we know. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the mid-20th century, hidden inside clay jars in the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea. They date from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. They contain everything from biblical texts to sectarian rules, hymns, calendars, and eschatological visions. Scholars generally agree they were the product of a Jewish sect possibly. The Esseneshu retreated into the desert to preserve their purity and await divine judgment. The scrolls are written mostly in Hebrew, Aramaic, and a dash of Greek. The material, parchment, papyrus, and copper. And they were astonishingly well preserved not just because of the dry desert climate, but also because of how they were treated before being stored. This is where things get strange. Some of the scrolls exhibit characteristics that seem oddly familiar to Egyptologists. The parchment is sometimes darkened, toughened, infused with organic compounds. Some fragments were wrapped in linen. Others seem to have been coated in resins or oils. In short, they resemble bandaged corpses. But not corpse scrolls. Documents, written and then embalmed. Why? Here's where the mummification theory enters. It's not that the scrolls were literally mummified in the Egyptian sense. No canopic jars, no natron, no gold masks. But some researchers have posited that techniques borrowed from Egyptian funerary science, particularly resin application and linen wrapping, were used in the preparation of these texts. The idea being that the scrolls were treated not just as information, but as sacred bodies, as living things, as vessels of divine spirit. Think about it. In both cultures, the written word was more than just ink on a surface. In Egypt, hieroglyphs were alive. They could act. Damage to a name could destroy a soul. In Judaism, the Torah was not just text, it was revelation, holy, unalterable. The scroll was both message and medium, sacred in every fiber. If you're in a scene, hiding out in the wilderness, watching the world slide toward apocalypse, and you believe that your library is not just history but hope, how do you protect it? You embalm it. You treat each scroll like a priest's body, preparing it for resurrection in the world to come. Now, is there hard proof that these techniques came directly from Egypt? Not exactly. There are similarities, there are overlapping materials, but direct continuity is hard to establish. After all, mummification as practiced in Egypt had been ongoing for millennia. By the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were being written, Roman Egypt was a melting pot of cultures, Jewish communities included. Alexandria alone was a metropolis where Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian traditions collided and cross-pollinated. It's not impossible that the Ascensor, whoever authored the scroll, had access to Egyptian preservation knowledge. Travel between the Levant and Egypt was common. Trade routes ran thick. Religious ideas migrated in both directions. Jews had lived in Egypt since the time of the Exodus, whatever that event actually was. But here's the twist. This theory may be less about forensic science and more about theological symbolism. Because Egypt didn't just give the world pyramids and hieroglyphs, it gave the West a template for thinking about death, resurrection, and eternal preservation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead. The embalmed body as a vessel for rebirth. The sacred word as a living force. These ideas didn't die with the pharaohs. They bled into Hellenistic philosophy, Gnostic cosmology, early Christianity, and possibly even Jewish apocalyptic thought. In this sense, mummifying a scroll wasn't about preserving data, it was about sealing a covenant. The scroll became a body, a martyr, a witness. It had to be buried, protected, awaited, like a prophet in stasis. So what do we actually see when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls through this lens? First, the physical parallels. The use of linen bindings on some scrolls, especially those in jars, resembles the bandaging used on mummies. The application of bitumen-like substances and organic compounds resin, possibly myrrh or frankincense, echoes the unguents used in embalming. The tight sealing of the scrolls within clay jars, some with lids resembling canopic vessels, feels less like storage and more like entombment. Even the caves themselves, the way the jars were arranged, hidden from light, tucked deep into the earth, suggests not a library, but a crypt. Second, the symbolic function. In ancient Egypt, texts were placed in tombs not to be read but to operate. They were spells, instructions for the soul. In Qumran, some scrolls seem to serve a similar purpose: ritual instructions, purification rites, eschatological scripts designed to be activated during the end times. The idea that these scrolls were preserved for future generations isn't just practical, it's messianic. They were waiting, like a king's body in a tomb, waiting for the soul to return. Third, the theological continuity. The idea of word as body isn't unique to Egypt or Judaism. In Christian theology, it becomes explicit. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But even before that, the Judaic tradition held the Torah as something pre-existent, created before the world itself. It wasn't written, it was. So embalming a scroll wasn't crazy. It was liturgy. It was faith. Now, critics of the theory argue that preservation techniques seen in the scrolls could easily be explained by local pragmatic solutions to storing parchment in a humid cave. That resin and linen were common, and their presence doesn't prove Egyptian influence. And they're right. No one is claiming that the Qumran scribes were embalming their texts with golden scarabs and chanting to Anubis. But maybe they didn't need to. Maybe just the idea had already moved the meme of preservation, the ritual of eternity, the silent language of sacred matter. Because Egypt didn't vanish when Rome conquered it. It lingered in rituals, in magic, in the very idea of memory. And it's not just the Dead Sea Scrolls that carry this echo. Early Christian relics were often wrapped, anointed, sealed. Monastic libraries were hidden like tombs. Even in modern times, we refer to certain texts as canon, a word that implies authority, finality, sanctity. A canon is not a bookshelf. It's a crypt. And so, when we think of the scrolls, those brittle, ink-stained spirals of apocalypse and law, we should not imagine them as books. We should imagine them as bodies, laid down with care, marked for resurrection, awaiting the end of days. And as we unroll them, piece by piece, fiber by fiber, we are not just reading history, we are performing a ritual, a mummification in reverse. And the story they tell leads us back full circle to the culture that understood resurrection better than any other. Back to Egypt, to gods who disappeared, to tombs that talk, and to amulets, those tiny, magical, charmsome, so strange we still don't know what they were meant to protect against, or who they were meant to protect. The amulets of unknown purpose. Amulets, small, potent, silent, carried in pockets, strung around necks, sewn into shrouds, tucked into coffins. They were Egypt's spiritual shorthand, divine signatures pressed into stone, faience, metal, and bone. Most of them are well understood, at least superficially. The Ankh for life, the Da-Jed for stability, the Eye of Horus for protection, the Scarab for rebirth. These are the amulets found by the tens of thousands, cataloged in museum drawers and gift shops, decoded and discussed. But then there are the others, the outliers, the amulets that don't fit, strange shapes, unfamiliar glyphs, miniature artifacts whose iconography doesn't match known gods, known spells, or known traditions. These are the amulets of unknown purpose, the pocket-sized mysteries that continue to baffle Egyptologists, archaeologists, and historians alike. Some are just weird. Some are unsettling. Some seem to hint at lost beliefs, secret rituals, or even entire cults that vanished without inscription. Let's start with the basics. What is an amulet? To the ancient Egyptians, an amulet was more than a charm. It was a vessel for divine power. It could ward off evil, heal the sick, guarantee fertility, protect during childbirth, or ease the soul's journey through the underworld. Amulets were ubiquitous, worn in life, enshrined in death. They could be inscribed with spells, shaped like deities, or fashioned after objects with symbolic meaning: keys, feathers, snakes, beetles, eyes, ears. But amid the known types lie anomalies. Objects clearly intended as amulets based on size, material, context of discovery, but whose form and symbolism are alien. Take, for instance, the so-called unknown head amulets. These are small, often stylized human or animal heads, sometimes hybridized, sometimes grotesque. They don't match any known deity or figure in Egyptian myth. Their expressions are blank, their features oddly distorted. Some wear strange crowns or helmets that don't appear in any other art. Were they regional gods? Demon protectors? Guardians of specific rituals? We don't know. Or the twisted cord amulet, simple shapes resembling ropes or serpentine loops found in burial contexts. They're sometimes mistaken for jade pillars or uraei, but upon closer inspection, they deviate in form and construction. Were they symbols of binding, protective knots? Echoes of some lost, mythological binding spell? Again, unknown. Then there are amulets shaped like tools or weapons, but tools we can't identify. Tiny blades that don't match any known form of knife. Abstract tools that resemble no practical object. Some theorize these were symbolic instruments for use in the afterlife, a kind of metaphysical toolkit for the soul to use during its journey through the dua. Others suggest they represent lost professions, sacred trades, or ceremonial roles no longer understood. And then there's the matter of the composite amulet species that combine multiple symbolic forms into one. An ankh wrapped around a falcon, a scarab fused with a jackal, a human figure holding a miniature pyramid. These hybrids don't match canonical representations of gods or known religious symbolism. Were they experimental, personalized? Were they crafted by regional cults with their own pantheons and theologies? Or were they simply misunderstood over time, their original meaning twisted or lost? Some of the most puzzling amulets come from children's burials. Tiny items shaped like animals, toys, or strange humanoid creatures with exaggerated features. They seem playful, almost whimsical, but their placement in funerary contexts suggests serious intent. Were these comfort objects? Protective spirits for vulnerable souls? Or representations of deities specifically associated with childhood that never made it into mainstream theology? And then there's the question of material. Most amulets were made from common substances: faience, carnelian, gold, glazed ceramics. But occasionally, we find amulets made from meteorite iron, rare desert glass, or bizarre stone composites with no known quarry source. These materials were not only rare, they were believed to be divine in origin. The iron was iron from the sky. The desert glass, formed by ancient meteor impacts, shimmered with unearthly color. When such materials were used to craft amulets with unknown shapes, the mystery deepens. Were these believed to be hyperpotent artifacts? Did they represent gods or spirits not just forgotten but erased? Because Egypt's history isn't just additive, it's subtractive. Gods were erased, cults were abolished, texts were lost. Temples fell to ruin. A god worshipped in the 3rd dynasty might be heretical by the 12th. A symbol used in Middle Egypt could be blasphemous in Thebes. Religious revisionism wasn't just tolerated, it was institutional. And with every purge, every shift in divine politics, came the burial of meaning. But the amulets remained. carried in pockets, laid in tombs, buried under sands. Some of them may have been intentionally cryptic crafted by mystery cults or magical practitioners who relied on esoteric knowledge passed down through apprentices, not inscribed on temple walls. This would explain the scarcity of context. These were not public-facing artifacts. They were private, secret, functional. Another possibility is that these amulets come from ethnic or cultural minorities within Egypt, Nubians, Libyans, Semitic groups who brought their own deities and customs. Their symbols would be unrecorded in Egyptian religious texts but preserved in grave goods and personal charms. Or perhaps they weren't gods at all. Perhaps they were entities, spirits, names not meant to be spoken aloud. The Egyptians had complex beliefs about demons and intermediary beings, entities that weren't gods but weren't human either, protectors, gatekeepers, monsters tamed through invocation. Could some of these amulets depict those? One particularly haunting category of unknown amulets are the faceless forms figures, with no features at all. Smooth ovals, blank heads, anonymous bodies. Are they unfinished? Or is the absence of features itself the symbol? A god, beyond identity, a spirit that changes shape, or a reflection of the unknown, an amulet meant to invoke protection against the nameless. In funerary contexts, such amulets take on an even more potent aura. If death is a journey, then the traveler needs companions, guides, guardians. Not all of them need names. Some are function over form, raw force. But what happens when we can't name them? What happens when the symbol survives, but the prayer is gone? We're left with artifacts of silence, echoes of belief we can no longer interpret. And so they sit in drawers, in vaults, in behind-the-scenes trays of museums labeled unidentified amulet, waiting for meaning. Perhaps the next find will link them to a known deity. Perhaps a yet undiscovered temple will hold the key. Or perhaps their meaning was never meant to be known. Because part of magic is secrecy. An amulet's power, in many traditions, depends on it not being understood. To name it is to tame it. To know it is to weaken it. And maybe, just maybe, that's why these amulets were buried. Not to be found, but to be hidden. To continue their work in silence. Unseen, unknown.